Hello, everyone. This is Thomas from the Double Edge Double Bill podcast. This is going to be another bonus episode that we're putting out in the interim while we start developing the new show that'll be coming out soon. And this bonus episode is one in which Adam and I count down our top 10 favorite film directors, the ones we consider the top 10 best sort of film directors out there. That's what this particular bonus podcast is, which was recorded back in December of 2022, so fairly recent in terms of the Patreon. A lot of fun to record in this particular one. But before I get into that, I just want to do some shout outs for the new show I mentioned. Will be going up in July. Just as an announcement here, we're going to be releasing the first episode. We plan on July 11th for that. A big thing as of recent over on our Patreon, patreon.com/DEDBpod. This week, while this bonus episode's going up, there are two things of note on the Patreon for those who just pay the $1 a month to get access to any Patreon content. You would be able to first hear a recently recorded bonus episode in which myself and the new co-host for the new show, Brian, have recorded a sort of on the edge of relevance style blurb about Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. So we go into initially non-spoilery thoughts and then spoilery thoughts on that. And also even before that, the first chunk of it is actually a bunch of new information about the upcoming show. We reveal the title of the show, and much more crucially, on the Patreon, this week you'll be able to vote in a poll, if you're a patron, where one of the things I'll reveal here about the new show is that every mini-series we're going to be putting out will have a classic movie of a certain type that'll be covered for whatever the topic of the mini-series is. In this case, the first mini-series we'll be doing for the new show is about blockbusters. And you all get to vote for the classic, which would be like pre-1980 movie that fits the blockbuster genre. And you all get to vote between two choices, which are Jaws and Star Wars: A New Hope, the 1977 first Star Wars film. So if you're a patron for that $1, you get to vote on which of those two will be the classic slot for our upcoming blockbuster series. So if you contribute that $1, you'll be able to listen to that bonus podcast and vote in that poll, which both those, like I said, are coming out this particular week. So you'll be able to do that and have access to all the other bonus content that we've had previously and in the future as we move forward with the upcoming new show. But now, without further ado, here is that top 10 list.
I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. Mariani.
AD, can I get some Vaseline for this lens? Like, a lot of Vaseline? Hello, Edgelords. Welcome to this month's bonus podcast here for December 2022. We decided, to wrap up the year in our rotation, Adam and I, where we tend to go through with the monthly bonus podcast, here's a commentary, here's this, here's that. We're wrapping up on a top 10 list, and for this top 10 list, Adam, we are doing something extremely daunting. That in retrospect, it was like, oh god, why are we doing this to ourselves?
Yeah, it was rough, man. This was a rough one. To be honest, though, most of the top 10s have been really hard. This one was difficult, too, just because there's so many that I want to put on the list. And I also didn't want to do, the pure obvious ones. This one was hard.
Yes, in case you haven't read on your podcatcher, what this top 10 list is about, Edgelord patrons, we are doing our top 10 favorite film directors. And we talked about this briefly in terms of the setup of just okay, what are our criteria? And what is your criteria, I guess, for at least the ones you include on the list? Is it, how many of great movies they did versus not great movies, or how many of your favorite movies are on there, or what did you really go into with this list in terms of your choices?
I more or less went with, some of my favorite movies, but also with the caveat that it couldn't just be like one movie in their whole filmography. They had to have pretty steady filmography as well. Because I mean, there's certain films that I absolutely love that are just sort of one-offs that I wouldn't put the director on the list. But for the most part, it's a combination of favorite and also overall quality.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you in terms of like, say for example, I love Muppets and stuff, and Little Shop of Horrors is my favorite movie of all time. I didn't put Frank Oz on my list. I think he's a
Right.
pretty consistent director, but I wouldn't put him as like one of my favorites of all time.
No, yeah, absolutely. Like I completely agree. I like some John Landis movies. Not gonna happen.
I mean, there's also that factor, yeah, of just like certain directors where it's like either they did make some of my favorite movies and they're either like pieces of shit in the case of John Landis who did horrible things, or people who like kind of fell off, like how many Tim Burton movies I love, but like
Okay, I could. Yeah, no way. Couldn't do it.
after a certain point, no, I can't put it in the cannot no. But I think also what was interesting was like a lot of my research for this kind of went by my Letterboxd list. If any of you follow me and not the Who's Tommy on Letterboxd, I make an absurd amount of fucking lists.
Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. A lot of them are like director filmographies, and I was like looking back at some of them, and there were certain ones where like it kind of snuck up on me, where I was like, oh wait, yeah, this person has a bunch of like really big movies that like I love, and I'm just didn't really realize they were one of my favorites until kind of putting this list together. Because it is also a combination of, I agree, like some of them I wanted to make sure there weren't obvious choices. I wanted to put some diversity on the list in general, some shout outs to people who I think deserve a lot more credit. But there were
Mhm.
genuinely a few where it's just like it kind of snuck up on me how much I genuinely just love their entire filmography.
Uh, yeah, me too. I mean, not so much in my main list, but definitely in my honorable mentions. There's quite a few of those.
And basically, everybody, as per our usual Patreon top tens, we will be going back and forth from each other's lists. So someone will say like this their first choice, and then the other person will say their first choice, and keep going down. But the thing is, the first 9 entries are just kind of in like a random order. There's not quite a specific like 10 to 2 kind of thing. But number one, the last one we'll mention, each of us, is our absolute favorites, which I think we disclose at least that much. Just like, don't steal my number one, motherfucker. It's this person.
Yeah, for
Don't
the
do
most
it.
part.
Right. But in terms of the other people, I'm not really sure about your list. I'm very curious.
No, there are definitely some that I was like, oh, he's going to put that, so I didn't. I think vice versa. But yeah, I'm very curious.
Right, and each of us will also be specifically shouting out at least like one favorite movie from that director, as well as at least one underrated one, though, in talking about them, because we'll also elaborate a bit on like why we chose them in overall. Like we'll definitely be mentioning several films in their filmography, I'm sure, as we describe what we really like about them, and of course also. As we kind of hinted at, these lists aren't definitive by any means. We could go multiple different ways with these lists. Like, you could ask me this same question a year from now, and I could give you 10 different directors, probably. Or at least maybe like 8 or so different directors.
You could have asked me a week ago, and
That's
you would have got at least half of this list. It would be different.
right, because we were talking like after a podcast record, and you mentioned just like, I'm still at like 35, Thomas. I need to whittle down.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
rough.
but you did. You did
I
somehow.
did it. I did it.
And you know what, Adam? Usually with these lists, we end up kind of starting with you as the first entry. I'm gonna steal it this time. I'm gonna start off this list with
Yeah, sure.
my.
Ego.
That's got so much ego on me. But I'm gonna go ahead and start with one that I guess might be a bit more obvious. But at the same time, it's one that like this is a director where he was definitely amongst like when I was starting to get into film, he was somebody who was like coming up at that time, and I realized like, oh, I love this guy's work. I am going with my first choice here of Mr. Wes Anderson, who of course does mainly like a lot of like comedy stuff, and is definitely known for sort of his very meticulous style, the sort of hipster fashion of sorts, as kids would like to say at the time he was coming up. But I think what I love about Wes Anderson is, despite the fact that his style, there's a lot of familiarity in that style, at the same time, there's so much like progression. I love like from Bottle Rocket all the way through like the rest of his filmography until his like most recent movie with the French Dispatch. You can see so much growth, I think, in him as a director where it's not just about the meticulous style, it's also about like what these characters are doing within there. You feel like, oh, okay, I'm like looking at this meticulously designed like almost dollhouse environment, but what about the dolls themselves? And I think with each progressive movie you get so much more like introspection and fascinating aspects of like what like his various characters go through. Some people might accuse of being rich white people like problems to a certain degree. I think some of them are more guilty of that than others. I don't think every one of his films is amazing, but at the same time, the ones that really work for me are just so beautifully done, and especially with like not just the production design, but the great performances he gets out of people, the really wonderful, small, subtle moments of just like introspection that people go through that is just usually conveyed by like really steady close-ups on people and stuff like that. I think he's a phenomenal director, and I would say my favorite of his is The Grand Budapest Hotel, which was his film from 2014 that I just think has so many fascinating layers to it about like how we sort of tell stories about our lives and how those stories like quickly go from like something fanciful in a Wes Anderson way to something a bit more bleak and a bit more that gives you like that ennui and tragedy that you kind of realize as like a life kind of goes along. And at the same time, there's lots of fun. There's spirit in this. Ray Fiennes is like maybe his best performance in most recent years in particular. He's so phenomenal in that movie. And then I would say for an underrated one, I kind of mentioned earlier his most recent film, The French Dispatch, which just kind of like came and went when it came out last year, and I think is a very interesting sort of anthology movie that like really displays the idea, especially with that one that's about like the French Dispatch, just like an American staffed paper in France, and you see so many elements of just like an American person in France, like the very certain perspectives of France and all this other stuff that you get from all these various different things. Jeffrey Wright, who is tremendous in that movie, has one of my favorite sort of like monologues in the middle of the last segment in particular. That's stellar. But I would say, aside from maybe Isle of Dogs and The Darjeeling Limited, I really like to love all of his other movies.
I mean, yeah, dude, I like Wes Anderson quite a bit too. I don't think I'm as big on him as you are, but like I love the Royal Tenenbaums. I love Grand Budapest Hotel. I agree with you. It's easily Ray Fiennes' best work in a long time, which is saying a lot because that dude's pretty fucking good. Uh, and I love Harvey Keitel in it. It's just so fucking ridiculous. But yeah, I haven't seen French Dispatch yet. It's definitely been one on my like to watch list. It's just for some reason I have gotten around to it. But yeah, I'm pretty much a fan of most of his stuff too. Even Isle of Dogs is not my favorite, but I still like it. The same with Darjeeling Limited. I still like it. It's not as high up on the list as like Grand Budapest or Tenenbaums or things like that. But I've been a fan of his since Bottle Rocket. Obviously, I remember when that came out. And it was like the new movie from the new Wunderkind, and I saw it and I was like, "Oh, this is actually really fun and weird. Like this is a weird movie, but I really liked it. I've sort of followed him ever since. I mean, honestly, I think French Dispatch is the only one of his I haven't seen. I just really, really enjoy Wes Anderson. I love the his use of symmetry in films and colors and things like that. I mean, it's really good. That's the one thing I could say about Wes Anderson, and probably about a lot of our directors we'll mention. There's no question it's a Wes Anderson movie when you watch it. Like it's absolutely a Wes Anderson movie, nobody else. And having a defining style that is still accepted and people still want to see, as long as he's been in the game, is not anything to turn your nose up at.
Yeah, and also that he's able to keep that kind of style when he even transitions from doing live action stuff to animated stuff like Isle of Dogs
Right.
or Fantastic Mr. Fox, which we covered on the
Oh,
show.
no, cuss.
You're cussing right. I'm talking about that movie. Um, but you know what, Adam? Let's go ahead and go with your first choice on your list.
All right. So I really wanted to put like a working man director, just a really reliable guy that, everything I've seen for the most part of his has been great. Even one of his movies is one of my favorite movies. It's probably my top 10. So I have Peter Weir. I just think he's a really reliable journeyman director. He's done a lot of really cool, weird things. I mean, from the Last Wave to probably, I would say most people think his most famous would be Truman Show, but he's done just really good stuff. It's really consistent work. Like I said, I've always appreciated sort of the directors who can go in and get the job done. Like I'd say probably the most famous one we got working right now, I would put like a Matt Reeves in that style. I mean, he might have more of a definable style now, but he was just like a really competent, capable director, and I think that's what Peter Weir is. And for his movies, I mean, we've talked about it on the show. I still love it. It's still great. It's probably my favorite sort of ship movie, if you want to call it that, but I have Master and Commander with Russell Crowe. It is one of my favorite movies from the way it's shot to the music to the acting to the story. I just think it's damn near a perfect film. And then for the one that it's a lot of people have seen it, but I just recently rewatched it, and it still holds up as like this really cool little self-contained thriller. I have Witness with Harrison Ford. Probably the first time I remember seeing Danny Glover in a movie, and he was terrifying in it. But it's just one of those I saw as a kid that always stuck with me. And like I said, I went back and rewatched it not that long ago, and I was still very thoroughly entertained with it. And it's one that if people haven't seen it and they want to see like a young Harrison Ford movie, I would recommend that. Or even a very underrated war movie, Gallipoli with Mel Gibson. It's a very underrated movie. I mean, Mel Gibson fucking sucks a butt, but it's still a really sharp little war movie. And I think you have to have talent and an eye in order to carry off these little things that really do have lasting power. I mean, everybody knows quite a few of his movies, but you might not know the guy who did them.
Yeah, I have only seen 3 Peter Weir films. I've only seen Master and Commander, which we did on the show, Truman Show, and Dead Poet Society. But at the same time, with those 3 movies, you can already tell, like, I would never be able to tell you that the exact same person directed those 3 movies. Because it's like the opposite of like the Wes Anderson angle, where you're kind of like surprised in a good way by like, oh wow, that guy has like such a diverse range in terms of the stories he can cover between like just those 3. But then I've always wanted to see Witness, I just haven't yet. And I know there's a couple other interesting ones. But yeah, I think that's a really great choice, and I think especially just for like that the celebration of the journeyman thing that you're referring to, where you might not be able to say like, oh, that's the distinctive Peter Weir style. At the same time, you can see like recurring themes, like in just those 3 movies I'm mentioning. They're all like sort of these movies that are about like people in these like bigger sort of institutions, whether it be like you're in like a weird reality show that you've been living in this whole time, or you're on a ship, or you're, in the case of even Dead Poet Society, you're within like the sort of a boarding school. I think like all 3 of those managed to like have a similar thing of like really introspective, fascinating like character studies within massive big systems that these characters are kind of struggling against to some degree. And yeah, I definitely, if nothing else, has made me support, like, I want to see more of his films for sure.
Well, that's hot shit right there.
Well, I'll continue with my list here. And my next choice is technically 2 directors, but I kind of brought this up to you, and they'll fit as one sort of pairing here. I have Lily and Lana Wachowski, the Wachowskis, who, these were definitely filmmakers when, like, if you had asked me, like, I don't know, like a decade ago or so, I wouldn't have said they were one of my favorite filmmakers. But I think especially after The Matrix Resurrections and sort of the tragedy of that incredibly interesting, vibrant, cool blockbuster movie failing and a lot of people dunking on it, I think it kind of rewired and made me realize that, like, even at their least sort of successful, I find the Wachowskis so fascinating for the big interesting leaps they're able to take, and not just technology, but also like how they can examine like what it is to be a person in the middle of like a sci-fi concept, like in The Matrix, which I would say is my favorite movie of theirs. Obviously, they managed to make like a very mainstream construct of that idea that I think they try and do in a lot of their movies, of just like, oh hey, I'm a person that exists within, that case, like a simulated world that I'm in, and I have to kind of try and like figure my way around it. And I think those themes have become more and more interesting as, you know, the Wachowskis transitioned, given they're trans filmmakers, and you can see like how much of that like really speaks within their films to a certain degree. I mean, keep in mind I'm a cis male guy talking about this, but at the same time, I think that helps kind of give you an interesting look at the fact that these 2 managed to really do such a great job of, like, after a certain point when they started especially becoming truer to who they were as people, they kind of realized like, oh, let's throw caution to the wind and do weird shit. And that they were always kind of doing, but like, even expounding further on it with, like, you know, the weirder movies that got them kind of thrown in director jail to a certain degree. Like, as many problems as there are with Cloud Atlas, I love the ambition and weirdness of that movie. Or even like a Jupiter Ascending, I have various problems with, but it's got its heart on its sleeve in a way that few blockbuster films manage to do. And I think it's even the case like with as far back as The Matrix, that's a like big sweeping romantic sci-fi action movie at the same time that's like really badass. They wear their emotions very clearly, and I think it makes it really endearing when, especially, you get to, I think, the underrated movie that I want to talk about is Speed Racer, which on paper is just like, oh, you could do just like a standard kind of like live action cartoon that like many people have tried to do, but that movie is so earnest and so joyful, and it's a movie that I've grown to love so much over the course of like since it came out, and then to like in recent years where I'm like, oh my god, this movie's great. Went from being like, I don't know, I have mixed feelings on this to like, I love it. And I think that's a big thing with their filmography in general. Is I've grown to appreciate their work more and more as time has gone on, in a way that, like I said, I've appreciate them more and more, especially as like the modern blockbuster landscape has become so homogenized. Like after I said Matrix Resurrections, like and like that failed so much, and we're in the limbo. But like if either of them will continue to do like movies to any degree, it really made me realize like I didn't know what I had until it was gone. For me, I know this might be a bit of a disagreement between the two of us.
I mean, I appreciate the Wachowskis. I appreciate their style and the fact that they are just who they are, and they've never shied away from certain topics or certain underlying themes in films and things like that. Like, I mean, even think about like Bound. How the fuck did Bound even get made? And it's just, it's Bound is probably one of my favorite ones they've done. The Matrix, absolutely. I mean, Matrix is a 5 out of 5 home run hit, no matter what you watch it. I mean, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it's still going to be great. Speed Racer, well, we know how we've watched that together, and it's fine. It's fine. There's a lot of fun in Speed Racer. It's better than I expected. I'll give you that. Would the Wachowskis be in my top? No, probably not even my honorable mentions. Just because I think they have done more stinkers than good. That being said, even if they did nothing but stinkers, they still gave us the Matrix. So for that, I get it. I get it. The Matrix is a masterpiece.
Well, Adam, who's the next masterpiece filmmaker on your list?
Oh, I have a filmmaker who has only 20 credits to his name, which is pretty wild when you think about it, just how revered he's become now in his ripe old age and how much work he's still pumping out. But first saw a movie with this. I mean, I was a young boy when I saw my first movie by this director, and it sort of blew my mind. And I've been a fan ever since. And I've gone back and, seen everything I can that he's done, and will continue to watch everything he does. And I have George Miller. George Miller to me is one of the still at his age, one of the most exciting directors working today. Just the shit that he's able to put on screen or even just get made, which is fucking crazy. And the two movies I'm going to highlight are his last two films that he's done. Obviously, Fury Road, no big shocker. It's probably my favorite of his. If not, I mean, I could interchange it with the Road Warrior, or even Beyond Thunderdome, or maybe even Witches of Eastwick, or just nonstop. There's so many, but I'll just say Fury Road because it's probably the most accessible for anybody if they're curious to see the movies we're talking about. Plus, it is a fucking masterpiece. It's one of the greatest reboot slash sequels ever made. The kinetic energy, the colors, the sound design, the character design. It's just so fucking George Miller. Like nobody else can do it. You've seen I don't know how many other post-apocalyptic films. None of them are the Mad Max films. None of them are Fury Road. It's its own unique thing that cannot be duplicated. I mean, people might have tried, but it never works. And then 3,000 Years of Longing. Like, how the fuck did he get that made? And obviously, he didn't do great, but man, what a just beautiful. Like, even if you just go by visually, it's gorgeous. If you go by the idea behind it, where it's a genie telling his story and how he came to be with the person who's got him now, great story, great idea, and plus just Tilda Swinton and Idris Elba. I mean, Tilda Swinton alone makes me want to see a movie. That woman, good God! I mean, she can go from making you laugh to creeping you out to just breaking your heart, and she almost does all three in this movie. And it's a spectacular performance, and by Idris Elba, it's a spectacular performance, and ultimately, the way the movie wraps up. I mean, I was sobbing and I was like, I'm so glad I've seen this. And anybody that I've recommended to who has actually watched it came away loving it. And only a guy like George Miller could get that made and have a studio be like, hey, you gave us Fury Road, here you go, what do you want to do next? I want to do a genie movie. All right. Yeah, it's fucking wild, but that's why I love George Miller. He's got this sort of maverick renegade sort of air about him where he's going to make what he wants to make when he wants to make it. I mean, just the fact that Fury Road is in 2015 and its predecessor was, in 85. 30 years later. Then he's like, yeah, I'll make another one. And now he's doing a prequel and possibly another one. It's so fucking wild to me. But man, do I love me some George Miller.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely one that you kind of hinted to me off mic that you were going to definitely put on the list. So I did not put Miller on my list, though I think he is great. I think you mentioned like 20 credits. A lot of those are like smaller short films. In terms of like feature films that have been released that he's directed, it's only been like 11. And even the amount of variety as well in that particular filmography is like mind blowing. Where you mentioned like four of them are the Mad Max movies, and then you 3,000 Years of Longing. But even before that, you have like The Witches of Eastwick, Lorenzo's Oil, the two Happy Feet movies, Babe, Pig in the City, and even the original Babe, which he's credited as like a writer-producer. Some would argue he maybe had more influence over the direction than Chris Noonan, who's the credited director. But regardless, I think that guy has such a fascinating, bizarre, like, back and forth to where, like, he's only made, like, that small amount of movies. But at the same time, like, each of them feel, like, so distinct. You can kind of see that kind of mad fascination. That's really like the recurring thing, is sort of like he knows how to capture sort of the anxieties and the madness that kind of like develops from any of these different situations. And I think that's even the case with my least favorite of his is probably Happy Feet. That is a weird kids movie. That is such a bizarre, weird kids movie that I'm so baffled made so much money enough to make Happy Feet 2, which is even weirder. I think that's the thing, is that you can never really quite predict the next move for a Miller, even like with Furiosa. I'm sure it's going to be even more like off kilter and bizarre than like Fury Road, because even like with the Mad Max movies, they all feel like so distinctly different, where you have like Mad Max is like on the precipice of the apocalypse with the original 1979 movie, then much more apocalyptic with Mad Max 2, very like in the distant past with Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, and then Fury Road feels like it's in this weird netherworld in between that at the same time you don't really need the exact chronology, because it's all about sort of the weird, bizarre lack of continuity with the Mad Max movies. But yeah, I think Miller's a true sort of mad visionary, and that I'm so happy still is like able to make movies in general in the middle of the studio system. And yeah, I'm very excited for Furiosa and whatever else he will do for as long as he will keep directing movies after that, which I hope is a very long time.
God, George Miller's Justice League. That would have been something.
That would have been very interesting, though.
Yeah.
I'm glad at least one cast member didn't end up becoming Batman, and we'll leave it at that. But
Yeah.
yeah. But for my next one on my list, I have, this is another one that kind of snuck up on me because technically they haven't made like a huge amount of theatrical releases, though if you include some of these sort of TV slash the Amazon things that they've done. They have a pretty robust filmography in their own right. I have Steve McQueen, who of course isn't the old school movie star of The Blob and Bullet, but the British black director who, like, he was another one where I went to like my ranking list of his and I'm like, oh yeah, these are all like at least good, if not like eventually to great. He's like such a fascinating filmmaker, especially considering the if you look at the theatrical films alone, where you go from like Hunger, which is like an Irish like hunger protest movie starring Fassbender, to Shame about sex addiction, to 12 Years a Slave, which is obviously like this bigger sort of like arguably Oscar Beatty drama, but I think that one's a lot more sort of like quiet and character focused in a way that makes it a bit above sort of like your average Best Picture winner, and then following it up with Widows. But then you also have the Small Axe stuff that he's done, which, if you don't know, was a series of like 5 feature-length movies that aired like on the BBC, but then were in the States, were presented on Amazon. They're all about West Indian immigrants and their experiences in Britain. He has such a fascinating way of like in any of these different subjects, whether they be genre focused or be a bit more like sort of based on a true story, you feel so much intimacy in any given scene. Like I remember when I started really becoming a fan of him was with Shame, which was, if you don't know, it's about Michael Fassbender who has a sex addiction, and there's a point where it's a one shot of Michael Fassbender having sex with this woman, and then the woman says, "I love you," and that gets him flaccid. And you just see in one shot how he just like dislodges and then goes over to like the window. It's just like he can't do it. he can't like have any intimate connection with somebody despite how much he likes having sex, and such a like upsetting one take that gives you so much intimacy in the middle of like a potentially like, oh, this is so like this is a raunchy, like, oh, he's having sex all the time. It's like, no, it's really sad and it's really upsetting. And I think he does such a great job of that, even within like the context of my favorite movie of his, Widows, which on paper is just like, oh, it's like a heist movie and all that. And we talked about on the show recently, like with our Viola Davis episode. But that movie does such a great job of integrating you into like the politics of Chicago and the lives of the individual women who are pulling off this heist in a way that's like both very intimate and subtle and engrossing, but also it's a kick-ass heist action movie at the same time. So wonderful with that. And then the underrated one I want to mention, besides just small acts in general, which is those five, all five of those are very good. But my favorite of those is one called Lovers Rock, which is about like a house party going on in London, and it's just about a bunch of these like West Indian immigrants who are in London trying to just have a party. And it's like extremely intimate. There's so much of just like how the party evolves and goes along, and there are subtle indications of like the threats outside with like police that are just kind of like scanning around, waiting to like sort of destroy this party. But it's like a really beautiful, intimate house party movie that isn't like as silly and over the top as like a house party, but it's like really beautiful and just shows like a bunch of people having a great night. And some people have a better night than others, but you just get a sense of like the full scope of this one house party in London that is like so beautiful and engrossing and fun. The needle drops are amazing. There's a whole sequence where like the DJ starts dropping a particular song and like everyone's dancing at the exact same groove to it. Everyone like it's such a beautiful display of like getting into the groove of like a group of people dancing at a party. It's tremendous. I think that whole series is phenomenal, but Lovers Rock is the best of those.
It's kind of ridiculous how many Steve McQueen things I haven't seen, to the point where all of them except Widows. I think I'm really not experienced with any of his work. I mean, you've recommended the Amazon Shorts to me several times. I just haven't gotten the chance. But
For the
eh,
small acts, they are feature films, not shorts.
I thought they were shorts.
No, they are all at least like 60 or 70 minutes long,
Oh, okay.
which is technically feature length.
Yeah, that's true. Well, then fuck me. But
It shows how inexperienced you are, Steve
yeah,
McQueen.
100%. But I do love Widows, so
Right.
I mean, I never would imagine he would have made your top 10. But yeah, I should go back and check out some of his stuff then, I guess.
Yeah, do it. But let's go on with your next entry on your list, Adam.
My next entry on my list is one of my favorite directors working today, especially with sort of sci-fi. Three of his big hits were sci-fi. You could argue four, but I have Denis Villeneuve. I think he's one of the most exciting sort of blockbuster filmmakers working today. Not all of his movies have done phenomenal at the show. Some of them have, some of them haven't. I've enjoyed everything I've seen that he's done, be it Prisoners or Enemy or any of those. Enemy, especially because of the fucking ending. What the shit? But yeah, I'm really excited for the future with this guy. I mean, I think he's got such a unique sort of artistic eye on how to frame things. Just really knows, how to convey to a cinematographer where to put the camera, and is really into concept design and things like that. And I just think, he's just fucking brilliant when it comes to sort of genre fare. And obviously, I think it's no surprise what my favorite pick of his is going to be. Dune, of course. I fucking love Dune. I've seen it I don't know how many times now. I could put it on right now and watch it from front to back. I'm super excited for the next chapter, especially with the bananas casting of Christopher Walken. That movie was so important to me, and it still is important to me. I absolutely love it. Everything about it worked for me. I mean, if you've heard us talk about it on Patreon before, but I absolutely just think it's a perfect film. Um, and then the other one that I'll mention, that I don't know that it's underrated, but it's just not talked about, at least that I see. And I also think it's a 5 out of 5. I have Sicario, which is a very sort of not genre movie about drugs passing from the border, and the sort of black ops that goes into trying to stop that from happening, and how crooked it could be, and things like that, and talk about potentially the best performances several of the actors have ever given. I mean, I think it's Emily Blunt's best. I definitely think it's Benicio del Toro's best. I think Bernthal's great in it in his little quick minute. I think Josh Brolin absolutely lights the screen up. I can never remember his name, but I just call him Burn Notice. He's really fun in it. It's just it's Sicario is just a really understated, quiet movie until it doesn't need to be, until there's action and just things happening. But other than that, it's just this sort of real sort of slow burn and then heights of action, then slow burn, heights of action. And I just absolutely love Sicario.
Jeffrey Donovan is Burn Notice, who you're referring to.
Yeah, Blair Witch 2, Burn Notice, whatever.
Right, Book of Shadows' his own Jeffrey Donovan, for sure. But yeah, I mean, Denis Villeneuve is definitely one of the more interesting sort of like bigger budget filmmakers working today. I don't love all of his movies, like even a Dune. I like a lot of aspects. I think it's the best possible version of a story that I think I have flaws with based on the earlier adaptations. We've talked about it previously. The 3 sci-fi movies he's done, because there's Dune, there's Blade Runner 2049, which is my favorite of his works, and also Arrival, which I think is like all 3 of those are very distinctly different sci-fi movies. Yeah, I think even at his worst, like I'm not a huge Prisoners fan, but there's great elements to that movie that I would say make it at least like fascinating to watch alone. And I'm curious, I want to go back to like some of his earlier films that he did, like they were like back when he was working in like French Canada and like Polytechnique and stuff like that. I've heard great things about as well. He wouldn't be necessarily on my list, but I think he's a totally worthy choice and one that I 100% get, especially you putting on your list.
I'm not going to forget what you just said about Doom.
No, I don't think you've forgotten it since we did our On the Edge of Relevance talking about it. It's been festering in your soul since we talked about it there. For my next choice, I have definitely another one that fits into sort of like the genre landscape, though he's not just specifically a genre filmmaker. He's, been working in the industry now for like over 40 years, and even as recently as earlier this year, he delivered a very fascinating movie, even within the constructs of like the modern film landscape. I have Mr. Sam Raimi, who, I mean, his start in like early low budget horror, evolving into like a lot of interesting experimentation in the 90s with like the studio system, what he could do with it, and then eventually, basically creating the superhero genre that we, are stuck in the middle of today. Like really perfecting the idea of what that is, and or at least like crystallizing what audiences wanted out of it. Sort of 3 top tier ones were just like that would put him on my list alone would be like my favorite is Evil Dead 2, which obviously is like one of the most gonzo, fascinating, like bizarre horror comedies that's ever been made. Tremendous movie that just has so much different ideas about experimenting within the construct of like, let's kind of remake the Evil Dead, but do the weirdest stuff we could possibly do with a bigger budget, and doing such a tremendous job of that with just the way he's able to use like his, sock puppet of Bruce Campbell to like make him like drag himself around literally by his own hand and stuff like that. It's a tremendous work of art in its own right. But like that, Spider-Man 2 and A Simple Plan are 3 of like the best movies within varying wide different genres that still have peaks of like what Sam Raimi usually does. Even with like, we talked about A Simple Plan, with like that one is the least sort of Raimi, but at the same time has so much of like that sort of like Midwestern earnestness that I think makes all of his work so interesting, because whenever you see him interviewed, he's just like, hey, buddy, hey, pal. That kind of, like, his persona alone also makes me so endeared to him when you see him in interviews and stuff like that. But as much as Evil Dead 2 is my absolute favorite, the underrated one I would say is The Quick and the Dead, which was a movie that like came out in the mid-90s, came and went despite a very stacked cast, and a really cool twist on the Western genre from like his perspective, with just there's so many great like montages of people like shooting each other that are tremendous, an incredibly stacked cast of just people at varying weird points of their careers. Like you have like a Gene Hackman right off of Unforgiven, and then a baby face Leonardo DiCaprio like not too long after Gilbert Grape. So many other people. It's like one of my favorite Westerns that especially like just has such a fun postmodern take on what like a Western can be, with like his camera angles and the various different like shootout sequences that happen. It's such a tremendous thing where, like I said, even as recently as this year, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness I had so many issues with, but none of them were the Raimi-isms. That's a movie where you can tell it's Sam Raimi just on the sidelines waiting for like, let's get through the sort of like Marvel cookie cutter bullshit, whatever. Are we done? Great. Let me do weird shit again. And it was so great seeing after like a 9-year hiatus him back on the director's chair doing something weird like that. And I hope it's not another 9 years before he directs another movie again. He was just recently announced he's going to make a remake of Magic, which I'm curious to see how the fuck that goes. But at the same time, yeah, whatever his next project is, hopefully it's not like too far away, because I just want to see whatever the hell he does, and he still has such spark and imagination left in him, despite being, like I said, in the industry for like 40 years at this point, still delivering, at least something with some kind of fun to it.
I mean, yeah, dude, Sam Raimi's the shit. I mean, I kind of figured he was going to be on yours because if not, probably would have been on mine.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love Sam Raimi. Plus, hey, he's from Michigan. Ooh, that's where I'm from.
Yeah.
Michigan sucks. Um, but yeah, no, I absolutely love Sam Raimi. He's so unique. Uh, I mean, look how many filmmakers now have paid homage to his quick cuts and things and other genre fare. I mean, Edgar Wright, for God's sakes, does it constantly, and people just love Sam Raimi, and because he's a genuinely nice guy too. But he has an artistic vision, and as much as it might have been, like you said, sort of churned through the MCU factory with Doctor Strange, there is still a lot of Sam Raimi in that fucking movie, a lot. And it comes through because he is that good. But yeah, I mean, Evil Dead 2 probably would be my favorite of his too. I mean, I really have a soft spot for Army of Darkness. I grew up with it, but Evil Dead 2 is probably his best, if not A Simple Plan. And Quick and the Dead, yeah, I love Quick and the Dead. Quick and the Dead's one of those. Anytime it's on, I'm watching it. Quick and the Dead to me only has one major problem, and that's its star. I don't think really works. But Arnett, I think everything else about it works. I think it's super fun. It's dirty. It's gross. The supporting cast is just like a who's who of like character actors. Like, oh my god, that's him. Oh my god, it's him. Oh my god, it's him. And it's nonstop. And yeah, I just Sam Raimi has such a much like we talked about with your Wes Anderson, where it's like you watch Sam Raimi movie, it's Sam Raimi. Like A Simple Plan might be the biggest sort of one that deviates from that, but there's still enough in there to where when you find out it's Raimi, you're not really surprised. That or that fucking Kevin Costner baseball movie, which is no good.
Or, I mean, like, Oz the Great and Powerful is even worse, honestly.
Oh
Like,
god, oh that I even dude, I completely even forget that he did that. What a terrible film. As bad as Oz the Great and the Powerful is, he's got five there masterpieces, so or damn near it. So yeah, no, Sam Raimi absolutely would have been on mine if not on yours. So I'm glad he's got included.
and for the record, I am a fan of Sharon Stone, The Quick and the Dead. I think
Not at all.
it works in a lesser but similar fashion to like a Man with No Name for me. It's a very kind of like tough person performance that I quite enjoy.
Yeah, I don't like it.
Well, who do you like, Adam? Who's the next person on your list?
Next person on my list got put on the list because he's made a lot of films with my favorite, like sort of classic actor. But then he's got a lot of other ones that don't feature that actor that are quite good. I have Michael Winner. Now, Michael Winner, to cue people in, he's made a lot of movies with Charles Bronson, who I absolutely love. Charles Bronson, always have. Ever since I honestly want to say my first exposure to Charles Bronson was like The Simpsons or The Critic, and I didn't understand. I'm like, what is going on here? Like there was Death Wish, whatever. The Critic reviewed. He's like, I got a wish to die, because he's in the hospital bed. He's so old. But I've always loved Charles Bronson. He has such a unique look about him, and I don't think anybody did much better work with him than Michael Winner. I know you're not necessarily a huge fan of the original Death Wish, and I completely understand. It is a dirty movie. Um, and I get why you don't like it. I still do like it quite a bit. I even like the second, and we've talked about the third one on the show. I love the
Hell
third one.
yeah.
The third one is batshit bananas crazy. That would be my honorable, like the one like people need to see it. It's so fun. It's crazy fun. But my favorite movie he's done, and it's a Bronson movie, is The Mechanic. I think The Mechanic might be Bronson's best. And it's also might be Michael Winner's best. It's such a cool little assassin thriller movie with a really great performance by Bronson, but a really great Jan Michael Vincent performance, which is kind of crazy. And it's just everything about it. I just absolutely love it. Obviously, they did the remakes with Statham, which were two varying degrees of suckage, especially the second one. Good God. But yeah, I just think he was one of those guys who he could do pretty much anything. He did comedy, he did western, he did the Bronson movies, he did some genre fare with sort of like thriller horrors. He did The Sentinel, which I'm not crazy about The Sentinel, but I get why people like it. But he's done, some really great stuff that is another one of those directors, much like probably a Peter Weir, that people have seen stuff he's done or heard of stuff he's done, but they might not tie him to all of the other different things they've seen. But to me, he had a definitive style. Just watching his Bronson movies, and I love him for that. I love the sort of '70s, late '70s, early '80s sort of grimy New York vigilante movies, and I think this guy was one of the best at them.
Yeah, I've only seen the first three Death Wishes and the Sentinel from Michael Winter. I think there's a lot of fascination with like even like with the original Death Wish. My problem has nothing to do with like the sort of the dirtiness and the sleaziness of like the aesthetics of that movie. This was just some of like the sort of moral ambiguity stuff that like the sequels afterward kind of throw out the window necessarily. Which I think the even like Death Wish 2 and 3 have like such bizarre like the canon film aesthetic added to it that makes it both those movies like bizarre and interesting. I haven't really wanted to pursue Winter's movies, just quite frankly. He's one of, we kind of mentioned this earlier, he's a person who's been accused of a lot of sort of like temperament issues and even sexual harassment stuff from actresses and stuff like that who were on his films.
See, I was unaware of this, to be
Yeah.
100% honest. Okay, so I'll change it for David O. Russell. He's fine, right?
Oh boy. Like there's been apparently a lot of sort of accusations made about Debbie Arnold. Apparently said that he made her expose her breasts for an audition and stuff like that she felt very uncomfortable with. And you can kind of see that in like the Death Wish movies, using sexual assault and rape as plot points for male characters of like these female characters. So I just haven't been as inclined to watch some of the further movies myself. But at the same time, there's a fascination with particularly the Death Wishes about how they kind of handle the vigilantism. I get why you would put him on the list at the same time, having especially not known some of those other elements about his character.
Yep, like we said, come back to me in a week. The list will be different.
Well, my next person on the list is another one of those that snuck up on me, where I recently went through sort of their entire filmography. Even like I watched like the last of his filmography I hadn't seen like only a couple months ago. But the more I thought about it, the more I find like he's definitely one of the ones where we kind of mentioned sort of the diversity with a lot of people on your list. This guy definitely I think fits that. I have Ong Lee. I like always liked Ong Lee's films, but until I like kind of was doing the research for this list, I realized like, oh yeah, how many varying movies that he's done. Where like there's a lot of like especially early on in his career, a lot of like intimate family dramas, especially in his original Taiwanese stuff like Eat Drink Man Woman and like the Pushing Hands, the earlier stuff that has like a lot of that intimacy. But even when he transitioned into doing like American productions, he was able to do a beautiful job with that, like in Sense and Sensibility, and even Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon has a lot of like intimate family drama at the same time. It's a big action movie, and I think that's the thing is that like, he's another one of those directors where I think it's been a common thing with a lot of the directors I've talked about is that kind of like intimacy even within genre that they're able to display, and I think he does such a beautiful job of that where like even in his worst movies, like where he's experimenting with big, massive, like high frame rate technology, like Gemini Man or Billy Lynn's Halftime Walk, those are weird movies to put like the high frame rate technology and massive budgets into, especially Billy Lynn. Like it's not a movie that I like necessarily, but that is such a bizarre, like, oh, this is what you're spending like the big, massive, like new groundbreaking technology on. It's just like intimate war drama about somebody performing at like the Super Bowl. That's really weird and bizarre, and I wouldn't have expected that. But in even successful movies he's done where he like has been groundbreaking in terms of like visual effects and stuff, there's still that intimacy that's there, like in Life of Pi. The two I want to spotlight, my favorite of his is Brokeback Mountain. I think that's such a beautiful story about like these, two gay men having some kind of relationship in the way, especially that like they've been trained because of like sort of the environment that they're in to have no kind of expressed emotion, to like really keep it bottled in. So when they're together and they do have a bit of intimacy to them, they are even still guarded, but there is still like a beauty between Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger. Their performances almost like they're bottled up and they can't really express their love only when they're just like in the most intimate possible situations. And it's especially how like tragic that ends up being, but in a way that doesn't feel like a lot of other gay love stories where it's just like, oh, there's the tragedy, that this, because of society, they can't be together. It's like it's even more about just like not just the societal angle, but just these two people can't quite communicate with each other at the same time. There's so many layers to it. It's such a beautiful, tragic movie. And then the underrated one, I'm going for it. Like, it's a movie that I didn't like when it first came out because I was a kid and I was not expecting what this movie was because of, I mentioned Sam Raimi, sort of like what I expected from superhero stuff. I think his Hulk is a much better movie than people would have given it credit for at the time. I think the movie is aged to be not like a great movie, but especially, I say it again, the sort of like Marvel MCU kind of like assembly line movies. It is such a fascinating experimental take on what like the Hulk is as a character and what that sort of means, especially where it feels more like a Universal monster movie than it ever does like a superhero movie, in a way that I find fascinating and engrossing. And I just think, whatever problems that the movie has, which there are many, I still find it like so much more engrossing and fascinating, and especially character focused in a way few superhero movies have done since.
All right. No, I like Ang Lee. I'm not necessarily a fan of all of his stuff, but I like Ang Lee as a visionary and as a director. I think he does a lot of interesting things, like you said, whether you like him or not. Like Gemini Man and Billy Lynn, you're like, okay, that's a decision. So you at least got to respect that. I am not a fan of Hulk. I think we've talked about this before. I still don't like it. There's parts about it I do like, for sure. I know a lot of people don't like sort of the comic book freeze frame stuff and all that, and I never was a fan of that either. But after I've watched it again and again, that becomes sort of my favorite stuff. Because like, why would you do this? It's such a baffling decision, but all right, cool.
Because it's like stylish and fun in a way that modern superhero
Right,
movies really
exactly.
aren't.
So I'm cool with. I mean, I don't like the Hulk, but I'm not as mad as I was when I first saw it when it came out. I think it's fine.
And nothing else, it's a very interesting curio that will never, ever, ever, ever happen again. Ever.
Never. No, never, never.
There's a great story about the James Schamus, who was the screenwriter that worked with Ang Lee on a bunch of movies, where he saw Spider-Man and everyone was like rousing and they were still in production on Hulk. And then he went over to the phone and was just like, they fucked us. This is not what they want from a superhero movie, like what we're doing. And true, they did not want that.
No, they did not want that, and you'll never see it again, at least from a major superhero character. But yeah, I mean, Brokeback, I've seen it a couple times. I like Brokeback Mountain enough. I think it's, I mean, like Heath Ledger is fucking dynamite, and so is Gyllenhaal. Gyllenhaal's accent's a little rough, but that's just me being sort of ADHD and harping and hanging on little things that bother me. I do think it really rides the edge of making it sort of a gay tragedy film, but it never really crosses into it too much. Like, let's put it like this, and I'm speaking for someone who is an LGBTQ, I identify as that. Um, if say one of them would have got AIDS, then it would have pushed it into the okay, like we're just going full blown, like it's a tragedy. It almost gets to that point, but it doesn't do it, and I think that's what makes the movie work as well as it does, because there is a lot of sort of gay tragedy tropes in that film, but I just think that it's done so well that it never comes across exploitive, which in the hands of a lesser director, I think it would have, but I think he handles it with like expert gloves, if you want to put it that way. I think it's done pretty well. My favorite from him is the OG, where the first time I saw it, I'm like, "What is this?" Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
I think is a masterpiece. Still to this day, I mean, it's beautiful. Michelle Yeoh, Zhang Ziyi, Chow Yun Fat. I mean, The Wire Fu, which I wasn't a fan of when it first came out, and now I'm like, oh yeah, fucking go for it. And that's the best example still of it. Maybe Hero, but Crouch Tiger, Hidden Dragon is a masterpiece.
Yeah, there's even like what I like is the fact that with even like Brokeback, like it's not necessarily that there's a tragedy, but even with throughout all of his movies, there's just like a general sadness that feels very human.
Yeah, maybe that's why I don't watch his movies because they bum me the fuck out.
They're very
Oh,
upsetting, sad movies mostly. Like even Hulk is a super sad movie.
for the most part, until he fights giant dogs or Nick Nolte bites an electrical wire, and you're like, okay, this is crazy.
That's true. That's true. But I've talked enough about that one, Adam. What about who's your next person on your list?
My next person on my list is, oh, I mean, probably, if he's not the top action director of the late 80s, early 90s, he's tied for top spot. I have a guy who Doesn't have a lot of credits, but he had like 4 or 5 bangers right in a row. John McTiernan. I mean, John McTiernan, it's crazy when you look at his filmography, which is not big at all. I want to say it's only like, yeah, it's like 12 movies. He's got 12 credits. And I mean, half of them are like masterpieces. You know, you got Predator, Die Hard, Hunt for Red October, Die Hard with a Vengeance. I like the 13th Warrior quite a bit. A lot of people like Last Action Hero quite a bit. So I mean, there's a lot on there that have just huge name recognition. And I mean, it's just crazy that 12 credits. 12. Predator is tied for my number one movie of the 80s with another director who may or may not pop up on my list. Uh, Predator is a masterpiece. So obviously that's going to be the one I'm saying is my favorite. But Predator is an 80s action, sci-fi, horror, macho machismo masterpiece. It just sweaty dudes with big muscles talking shit and stupid one-liners fighting this brilliantly designed creature in a sort of unique and distant setting. It's fucking great. It's fucking great. And the soundtrack and everything just works perfect. There's nothing about Predator I would change. Not one thing. And then one that, you know, originally I was going to put 13th Warrior as like, oh, underrated. And I do feel it's underrated, but I know people hate that fucking movie. But one that I do want to put that maybe people don't think about enough because of sort of the two sequels that followed it and maybe even the one before it, but it still holds up as just a thrilling action movie is Die Hard with a Vengeance. I think Die Hard with a Vengeance, you know, before part two was my next favorite, but now that after you and I have actually watched them all,
Right.
three is like set next after one. One's still my favorite, but three would be next. And it's super fun, great buddy cop thing with him and Samuel L. Jackson. Jeremy Irons is great as the Simon Gruber. Beautifully shot in New York. You get really the sense of New York, whether they're in the city or they're on the roads or in the tunnels and the aqueduct. It's a thrilling fucking action movie. It's really well done. And like I said, it's just crazy to me that 12 movies and this guy did, you know, Predator, Die Hard, the Hunt for Red October, which is also fucking great. But I mean, he did do Medicine Man. So John McTiernan is one of those guys where it was like he was gold for a minute.
Yeah, I think McTiernan is like I've kind of talked about this with some of the other people on my list about just like sort of along with like the general filmographies. I also really like the sort of career trajectory of certain filmmakers, and especially McTiernan is one of the most fascinating because it's like you mentioned. Aside from like Nomads was his first movie, which is like apparently a horror movie with Pierce Brosnan that no one's like really seen.
I've seen it. Yeah.
Is that a top tier McTiernan? Is that tiered McTiernan?
My favorite part of Nomads is that Adam Ant plays like a big supporting role.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yes, which
Yeah.
is weird already,
Fucking
but
wild.
but anyway, yeah, like the sort of that career thing of like Predator, Die Hard, Hunt for Red October, like those three movies alone would be like, oh, this guy's like made. There's nothing like wrong with him. But the steep dive, not even in terms of like I would argue quality, but just in terms of like the sort of box office like disaster of it, like the infamy of Last Action Hero. And then like Die Hard with a Vengeance kind of buoys Immigrant, and I agree that I think that's the best of the Die Hard sequels. But then like 13th Warrior and Basic and Rollerball and Medicine Man, even like those are like disastrous movies in terms of like just like the studios, like it helped put him in director jail before he went to regular jail for like the weird like wiretapping thing, which is also bizarre, where it's just like, oh, problematic directors like we talked about with like Michael Winner. That one's just weird because it's like, wait, you went to prison for that, for like a wiretapping thing? That's insane. Like that dude has such a fascinating sort of trajectory there. And even you mentioned 12 credits. There's only like 11 that have been released. There's the 12th one that's listed on a lot of sites is the one that's in production. And he's like apparently like, I'm gonna make my comeback. I'm gonna come back with this new movie. And I'm like, I kind of want to see whatever that is because like what's John McTiernan gonna do now?
I mean,
like, I've spent 20 years in like prison. And now I'm out.
I gotta see it. I just hope it's not. Nah, it's okay. I either want it to be great or suck.
Right, but suck in like a big, massive way.
Yeah, huge, right? Like, what the fuck is this? That's yeah.
Right. I think that's the thing, is like this, he's one of those directors for sure where it's like, despite sort of the inconsistency there in the filmography, at least it's just like wide ranging, where it's just like, I'm either going big with a great movie or big with a fucking terrible bomb that should have ended my career, but don't worry, I'm gonna make it like two more huge bombs after that. And I stick up for Last Action Hero. I think Last Action Hero is very fascinating, especially in a modern context of like deconstructionist blockbusters. Like, especially like, I don't think you get Phil Lord and Chris Miller's like stuff on the Lego Movie 21 Jump Street without Last Action Hero.
I fucking hate it.
Maybe we'll talk about that on this show someday. Who knows? But let me go ahead and bring up my next person, who is another one of the ones that kind of snuck up on me. But especially considering like this director hasn't made a lot of movies, and I haven't seen all of his. Like, I believe he's only made a total of 8 movies that have been like released feature films. But I would say 4 of the 6 I've seen have been tremendous, beautiful, great movies. I have Alfonso Cuarón, who is another great example of sort of like a foreign filmmaker who I haven't seen his first movie that is actually like in Spanish. I haven't seen that particular one. But like so many of his movies are so fascinating with especially how, once again, he's another great director who does a lot of like intimacy no matter what the genre is. Like, I love Ichimama Tambien, but the fact that like that guy went from Ichimama Tambien, which is like this great, like very sexy but also very sad in its own way movie about like growing up and finding sort of a sexual awakening, and then realizing that like, oh, maybe like we were kind of like fucked up kids who didn't know what we were kind of doing to a certain degree, but still wrestling with the fact that like some of those feelings still work. Like, it's such a beautiful, intimate character story. And then he makes like the best Harry Potter movie right after that with Prisoner of Azkaban. It's so amazingly is able to go from like that and then even swing back to like right after that is like Children of Men, which is such a tremendous movie, and that would be my favorite of his overall movies, which is such a great sort of like dystopian sci-fi movie that has like such a great like feeling of the world. That's a big thing with like all his movies. I love how he evokes setting in all of these things, like not just like the intimacy that's going on with the characters, but the scope of the setting, whether it be like the entire world falling apart in Children of Men, or like the beauty and like mysteriousness of like, you know, Hogwarts and all that other shit in Prisoner of Azkaban, especially after another filmmaker had done 2 movies before that in that series. Like, he does such a great job of really engrossing you in these environments at the same time you're engrossed in like the characters. And I think whether it's on like a big massive scale, like with Children of Men, where like those amazing one shots, they're at the same time very focused on character, like the whole thing with like the car motorcycle chase and Julianne Moore getting shot, like you're still within the perspective, like the characters in the situation, so you're not distracted by the amazing filmmaking going on. Like, even Gravity has that as well, where it's just like, oh my god, like so much technical craft is going on, but I'm just immersed in Sandra Bullock's journey this whole time, and you're just like so fascinated by it. I think that's the big thing he does, is he manages to get you fully engrossed in the characters so that the world stuff is there and very present and you feel it, but it doesn't distract from like the story that's so character focused at the same time. And then the honorable mention is like one I actually didn't watch until this week in prep for the show, as sort of like a sliding scale of like, am I going to include him on the list? And I still think works, even though I would say it's my least favorite of the movies he's done, but I still think it's very good, is A Little Princess, which was his first like English language production. And I think it's such a really great kids movie that at the same time evokes a lot of these like sort of intimate, sort of close angles, where it's like it's about this young girl who is sent off to a boarding school by her father, who's like fighting in World War One, who goes missing and is presumed dead, and then she becomes basically like a servant to the woman who runs the school. And there is like such beauty and like the look and lavish design of all this, but you still feel the sadness of this character as she's stuck in like this great opulent sort of like boarding school for girls. But you realize like how trapped she is, because she's like, oh, I'm no longer like a young girl. I have to like grow up very fast because I'm forced into a real world that is like so awful to me and shitty. Despite there's some weird like racial implications with that movie. About sort of because she's like a young British girl who came from India, and she tells like a lot of these stories about India. They're a bit off, I think, just based on the original source material, and some other elements there. But at the same time, I think it is like I get why that was sort of like apparently a big thing for like young girls in the 90s, kind of like grew up loving that movie. And even just watching it very recently, it's like, oh, it's so cute and immersive, and despite some of those questionable elements, it still is like very earnest, and I respect what it's doing at the same time. A tremendous example of like a filmmaker going from like his native language to an English production that is still like very lavish and beautiful, but still has a lot of that intimacy that he would have in a lot of his other movies to go from there.
Azkaban is the shit, right? Like it is the best Harry Potter movie in my opinion. Always has been since I've seen it. But yeah, I mean, Alfonso Cuarón. I mean, Children of Men alone is a masterpiece. I mean, the beauty of that movie and its sort of desolate and destruction. I mean, it's sad and depressing, but it's fucking great. No, I'm a big fan of his. He hasn't done. I think he only has like 20 credits total. Um, and but again, I'm sure some of
including
those are
short films
shorts.
and
Yeah,
stuff like
shorts
that.
and
Yeah.
stuff like that. Yeah. I'm probably one of the only people on planet Earth that has not seen Gravity because I'm claustrophobic and I'm like, nope, 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 not gonna do it. Yeah, I mean the things of his that I have seen, I've really liked. Of course, like you said, You Two Mama Tommy Ann is great, but I even liked Paris Yatami. It was pretty decent. Like he's
Right,
just
you
a
have one of the segments in that. Yeah.
yeah, he's a really like sort of I don't want to say underground, but he's one of these guys that you don't see much of. But when he does, you're almost guaranteed it's gonna, if not be great, it's gonna be something you're gonna want to talk about. Like I haven't seen Aroma. I've heard mixed things on it, but I mean, it was nominated. People were talking about it. Like he's an
And he won
exciting,
another Best Director Oscar for that
right?
movie and stuff
He's
like
an
yeah, right.
exciting director. So yeah, I definitely like Alfonso Cuarón. Would not have been on my list. Maybe if we were going like sci-fi movies, I would Children of Men, sure, probably would have been on there, but and so you would have got the mention. But yeah, still, I completely get it. He's really exciting.
Yeah, and even like with Roma, like I have seen that movie and I didn't love it nearly as much as so many other people did, but there are beautiful shots in that movie. There's so many like great immersive, like beautiful, like the last shot of that movie. It's like a giant one take that's like 10 or 15 minutes. It's like beautiful, and I'm crying at the same time. I didn't love that movie. It still is like so engrossing, and I think that's what you get with a guy like that. And especially, yeah, he's definitely one of those where like he takes such big breaks in between projects. Like I know he's doing like a TV show now. Is like his most recent thing that he's gonna do, and I'm like, he hasn't
Yeah,
done
that's what
that
I heard.
before.
Yeah, why
Curious to
not?
see what he's doing now, for sure on
Oh,
that. But please, your next entry on your list, Adam.
all right. So this is the guy I was sort of alluding to as long as the companion piece with McTiernan. This man is never anything but interesting. He has made some of the most bonkers what the fuck movies ever, at least in the modern age. He has made to me the greatest film to come out of the 80s as far even if you want to say just sci-fi or action, but for me period, I think in its cynicism and everything else, I think it's perfectly an 80s film, and still translates today, which is saying a lot, and he's done that a couple times. I have the just wackadoo fun loving wheeling and dealing Paul Verhoeven. I fucking love this guy. Everything he's done that I've seen, even if I don't like it, I'm still like, Paul Verhoeven took a swing on this. Everything he's done. Showgirls, for God's sakes. That guy took a fucking swing. Did not work. Or at least for general audiences. Hollow Man, same thing. I mean, the guy has done just batshit crazy things. And he's given us one of the top three Arnold Schwarzenegger movies of all time. He's given us one of the biggest box office bombs that have now become a cult hit of all time. But he also gave us the movie that I would say is my favorite, which I'm sure is no shocker to anybody, RoboCop. I think RoboCop is a perfect 80s film. I think it perfects and furthers the genre of sci-fi action, but also deconstructs it in a really weird, fun way. I think it has a lot to say, both about politics and sort of class. I think it is just a masterpiece from beginning to end. Everything works for me. There is not one thing I would change. Even Paul Verhoeven crazy dancing at the camera, I think is just great. And that's an image that sticks with you. That fucking one image stuck with me forever. And I didn't know it was Paul Verhoeven until, I don't know, 10 years ago. He's just one of these guys that anything that comes out, I'm excited for. Like, Benedetta? What the fuck?
Yeah, Benedetta.
Jesus Christ, man. But for my sort of the one, like, it's not underrated. It isn't, but it's one of those, like, I think it got misinterpreted at the time. I think it's gained the audience now that understand what he was trying to do, but I don't think it did at the time. Was Starship Troopers? I think people looked at Starship Troopers as a sci-fi horror film with some action in it, and they didn't really understand that he's basically doing what he did in RoboCop again, but for the '90s now. And I think Starship Troopers is just a boatload of fun, and I think it's got a lot of good points and poignant meaning behind it. But at the same time, only Paul Verhoeven can get across those sort of messages that he's trying to do, while clearly not high school kids are just shooting down giant cockroaches and shit. Like, it's fucking crazy. It's crazy, but it's great. Yeah, he's definitely another one of those guys like a George Miller, to where he still is just beholden to his thing. He's going to do what he wants to do. And anytime there's a new Verhoeven thing, I'm like, oh, I got to see it. And I will continue to be that way until he stops making movies.
Yeah, I mean, I love me some Verhoeven. He was definitely an example of, like, I would have definitely put him on my list if I didn't think you were going to put him on there. So I didn't. But at the same time, yeah, I love Verhoeven. I agree with, like, so much of what you're saying. And I think especially what's so interesting about him is that he definitely feels like a filmmaker where obviously he stopped making Hollywood movies, like, around the time of, like, Hollow Man or so. And I think it's because he managed to make, even within the studio system at the, in the 80s and 90s, like, very challenging blockbusters, which is something you don't really get anymore, especially just like movies that genuinely challenge an audience's expectation and their sort of like values. Like RoboCop did that in the 80s, and everyone just kind of like loved it and either embraced those like elements or just kind of took it on face value for like being just a badass action movie. And I think that's the kind of fascinating thing, is like he makes movies for both the smartest and the dumbest person in the room to a certain extent, but at the same time there's always that challenge that's there, even in the more recent like sort of movies that he's done. Like you mentioned Benedetta, which I fucking love, and it's still just proof that like, oh, this guy is like what, in his 80s, and he's still like willing to make a movie that incredibly challenging and bizarre and fascinating and kind of exploitative, but in a very interesting, engaging, and meaningful way. And even like the one he did right before that, Elle, which has many elements that I'm just like, I don't know how well this necessarily works, but at least it's like he's a guy that makes you think at the same time that you're entertained, which is something that we've kind of, I think, lost in the modern sort of like film landscape with a lot of like directors who work regularly. He's one of those guys where it's like, no, I am going to entertain you and then make you challenge, like, why was I entertained by that? Is it because of the satirical elements that I'm getting, or is it because I'm not getting that and this is just fucking fun in a like depraved way that I'm kind of embracing like my inner sort of like animal instinct? There's like so much there, and yeah, he's a tremendous director. Love most of his works, and even those that I don't love necessarily are still incredibly fascinating. And we've talked about a couple of his movies, like especially even just as recently as Showgirls. That is distinct.
That
There
is
is
a movie.
no other movie like Showgirls.
Absolutely not, and there never will be again.
But I'll go ahead with the next person on my list, who is another filmmaker that does challenging works that I would argue most of them are not very mainstream to any degree, but he's definitely another one of those where when I first started watching his work, I was more confused and befuddled by what was going on, but the more I think about them, the more I like really feel them on a weird, deep emotional level, even if I don't understand every single element that's what's going on. But I have David Lynch, who is one of those guys where, like I said, when I first started watching like Eraserhead and all this other stuff, I was like, I don't know if I really like get this. When I was like in high school, it's like, I don't know, this is weird to me. I don't know if I can really embrace this, but he's definitely one of those guys that like his movies stick with you. And you really embrace, even if you don't know every detail about what's going on, what the symbolism is. At the same time, you're just like, I feel something like at my deepest core about this movie. Some feel in like I don't like this whatsoever, but for me, it's just sort of like on a primal level, I am so taken aback by what he's doing with any of his movies, whether it be like Eraserhead or even some of his more mainstream movies that aren't like as surreal, like The Elephant Man or Straight Story. There's such like a beauty and once again a real embrace of the characters, where it's like, even despite the fact that these stories are very untraditional and odd and don't follow like a familiar structure, there's still so much like beauty and heart and love in what's going on at the same time, that they're very like vile and disgusting and shit, like the depravity of people. Even like when you transition to TV with Twin Peaks, he managed to do that and briefly get audience attention and fascination, even if they lost kind of that attention after a certain point, and then came back with like the Twin Peaks: The Return, which is one of, I think, the best seasons of television that's ever existed, and I love so much. But in terms of his filmography, I would say my favorite of his is still Mulholland Drive. We talked about it on the show, but I love that movie. I'm so engrossed in like the weird noir elements that are going on at the same time. There's this beautiful kind of like tragic romance that's going on between Naomi Watts and Laura Herring. I think the both of them are like so tremendous in a way that's like really engrossing in the romance, and then the tragedy of it breaking apart still stands at the same time. There are horrible people like behind dumpsters and weird people that like from Hollywood that like come from under the cracks and like show up. There's so many bizarre elements there, but I just like love so much about that movie. And then in terms of an underrated, there were a couple that were kind of vying for the spot. Like I really became more a fan of Lost Highway recently after a rewatch, but the one that's like my MVP in terms of like underrated, just in terms of like it's not even that accessible anymore. But I just like love how weird and off kilter it is, but at the same time it's like beautiful and embraces its emotions on its sleeve once again. Is Wild at Heart, which I think is like one of my favorite Nicolas Cage performances. Dern is amazing in it. Willem Dafoe. There's just like so much there where it's like this weird road movie that turns into like an upsetting crime movie and a violent gore movie, and then it becomes like a Wizard of Oz homage by the end of it, and the weird mix of like Elvis music and incredibly intense like metal music at the same time. There's like such there's so much going on there that like veers into like comedy and melodrama and romance and like so many like weird beautiful elements. I think that's the big strength of Lynch is like he manages to like have these movies that go into all sorts of bizarre directions, yet you believe in the emotional journey of the characters at the same time. I've said this before when we've covered his movies on the show. Despite how sort of like weird and like untraditional the stories are, they are all emotionally true. You feel something on like a true primal level, an emotion that really connects you to any of these people, no matter how weird and bizarre they are. Much like Lynch himself, who he's another one of those guys where just on a personality level, he's so fucking great. Like, it's so great seeing him in interviews where it's just like, are you watching a movie on your fucking phone? And it's so funny to see. And just shout out, he was in a recent movie that's probably going to get a lot of Oscar nominations from another director I might mention later on this list, and he's amazing in it. But we'll put a pin in that for a bit later.
I mean, yeah, dude. I mean, he's David Lynch. I'm not as crazy of a David Lynch fan as a lot of people, but everything I've seen of his, love it or hate it, there's nobody else that's doing it like him. I mean, David Lynch is so fucking incredibly unique. I would agree. I think Mulholland Drive is probably my favorite of his, if not Lost Highway. Lost Highway, I mean, even the soundtrack alone is a fucking banger. A lot of David Bowie, a lot of, I mean, it's really pretty great.
Rammstein.
This first time I heard of Rammstein was the
Yep.
Lost Highway soundtrack. Well, some Trent Reznor's on there, like Angelo Badalamenti, like there's some good stuff on there. Wild at Heart might be the movie that creeped me out about bad teeth.
Yeah.
Because Willem Dafoe's teeth are fucking horrible. It's terrifying. But yeah, no, David Lynch, he's one of those guys to where, again, yeah, I think we're seeing sort of a pattern with your list. Maybe not a complete pattern, but you have several on there that they're so definitive. They're the influences for the new generation, which is pretty spectacular when you think about it. Like these guys are still working, like a Wes Anderson, like a Sam Raimi, like a Lynch. That these guys are still going, still making movies, still doing things, and the new crop of filmmakers that are being celebrated are listing them as sort of like, oh, I was influenced by this guy. This guy, really made me want to make movies, and it's pretty fucking great that at least we still have that sort of pipeline open to the filmmakers of the past. And Lynch is definitely one of those I would put on that list who is so fucking unique. Love or hate his movies, you gotta at least respect that. Again, he does them his way, and he's only done it his way, and will continue to only do it his way.
Very true. But who's the next person who could only do it their way, Adam, on your list?
Okay, we're getting into the C's now. It's funny. My next three, all their last names start with C, which I didn't do on purpose. So probably not going to be a shocker to anybody. It was going to pop up on one of our lists. I have probably the guys that maybe really appreciate weird comedy and just sort of off-kilter personalities in movies. Uh, I have the Coen brothers. The Coen brothers, to me, like I'll never forget when I first saw the movie Raising Arizona as a kid. I didn't know what the fuck I was watching. Like I was just like, I know this is funny, but everything is so weird. Like, why is this so weird? Because as a kid, you can't process it. Like, why are these people acting like this? But it's so funny. Like I remember literally there. I want to say there's even either pictures or a video recording of me laughing till I think I pissed myself. And I was like 5 when John Goodman is pulling William Forsythe out of the mud. And they're the whole time screaming. For some reason, it just got me and made me laugh so hard. It's one of the funniest things I've ever seen, and they've continued to do that to where, oh my god, it's so funny, it's so funny, it's so funny, and then they'll hit you with Miller's Crossing or No Country for Old Men, and you're like, holy fuck, these guys can get really serious, but yet there's always that tinge of sort of dark humor to it. I've absolutely loved the Coen brothers. I just think they're so fucking unique. I mean, if anybody can question that, watch Macbeth. What the fuck? The guys who made Big Lebowski did Macbeth?
One of the guys who did Big Lebowski.
I know, but the guy who made Big Lebowski, one of them, made Macbeth. It's fucking crazy. Like, it's crazy that these guys are, I mean, they're so talented. So, I mean, obviously, my favorite, I have so many I could choose. I mean, I could, of course, say Big Lebowski. I could say Raising Arizona, but I'm going Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Every time I watch it, again, beginning to end, I love the soundtrack. I think that's one of their funniest, at least of the modern ones. I think George Clooney is his funniest performance. Tutorials kills me. Just everybody in it just really works, and I think it's just so fucking funny, and it's such a Coen Brothers movie. Um, but again, like we were talking about with some of your choices, if you watch a Coen Brothers movie, for the most part, it's a Coen Brothers movie. They have a certain sense of style and sensibility to their stuff that it's just nobody else could have done it. And then for my underrated, sort of underseen one, it's one we've talked about in the show. Uh, I didn't watch it until we did for the show, and it's become one of my favorites. I have Inside Llewellyn Davis. Again, great fucking movie, beautiful movie. Maybe Oscar Isaac's best. Great fucking cameos by a lot of the regulars, like especially like John Goodman. And again, their soundtrack, their score, those guys know how to put fucking music to movies. Anything that they're involved in, I want to see. I really, really want to see. And I mean, it harkens back to one of your choices, Sam Raimi. They worked on The Evil Dead with him. It's just they're masters of modern awkward comedy, and I absolutely love them.
Another great example of one that I would have definitely put on my list if I didn't figure Adam's going to put that on the list, right? Those two are going to end up on Adam's list, so I might as well not. But yeah, I mean, I completely agree with all that you've said, and especially just the fact that, like, even with the Coen brothers, there's also even distinction within their works. Like, you can tell, oh, this is a Coen brothers comedy versus, oh, this is a Coen brothers drama without, like, even much of any comedic relief whatsoever. Like, just the contrast between, like, No Brother, Where Art Thou to A No Country for Old Men alone.
It's the dialogue.
Yeah, that's the big tell, for sure, yeah. Especially because they write so many of their own movies. But yeah, I think, I mean, it's especially ever since, like, and there are another couple people who, like, crossed over with Sam Raimi a lot, because Joel Cohen was initially, like, an editor on The Evil Dead, and you can see, like, kind of their influences kind of, like, meeting toward each other with, like, Blood Simple, but even how, like, that evolved to, like, Raising Arizona has tinges of Raimi, but it still is, like, so very bizarre in their own right, and just their progression forward. They're also just fascinating filmmakers, and even just the fact that they've split up, it's a bummer, it's unfortunate. Even at the same time, I like Macbeth a lot, but I'm also so curious about Ethan Coen's new movie. That's going to be his first one by himself, where it's apparently a Russ Meyer-inspired action sex comedy starring Margaret Qualley and Geraldine Viswanathan from Blockers.
What is that going to be?
I'm very curious. Like, I believe it's him and his wife wrote it.
Yeah,
it's very weird.
Yeah.
I'm very fascinated to see what that is, and the same way that I was with, like, Macbeth. But I would say, in terms of, like, the underrated ones for me, I would say the one I would spotlight so much is Burn After Reading. I think that one, just because right after No Country for Old Men, they put out that, and everyone was, like, kind of confused by it. But I've been, like, a diehard defender of that movie ever since it came out. That movie's so fucking funny, and so good, and so massively underrated.
I mean, yeah, I can agree with that. I would say that's Clooney's maybe next best comedic performance.
So fucking funny in that movie. And McDormand, Richard Jenkins, Brad Pitt, everybody's so fucking funny in that movie. But I'll go ahead and go to my next person, who's dabbled in comedy a bit, but is more known for his big, sweeping, sort of like initially blockbusters, and then the sort of Oscar baity stuff he's done a bit more recently that still is very good, and I'm not trying to dismiss him by saying Oscar baity, but someone was going to put him on one of their lists. I kind of said to Adam, like, I kind of want him to be on this list. He's kind of like the most obvious person, but he's not quite number one. You had asked me, like, a couple of years ago, I probably would have said number one, but still at the same time, very sort of, like, beloved to me, and I still think very consistent despite having a fair amount of bad ones in his own right. I have Mr. Steven Spielberg, who, I mean, what can be said about Mr. Steven Spielberg, of course, is like so much has been about like the creating the blockbuster with Jaws, or then kind of evolving it into like the Indiana Jones trilogy, and then going into like Jurassic Park and like revolutionizing digital technology, and then going into like his more recent, very upsetting, sort of like drama focused stuff with like Munich and Saving Private Ryan and, you know, Lincoln and all these other things that are just like so, it's such a fascinating way to see, like, you can still see so many of his directorial flourishes at the same time. Like, he's another example where, like, you can, what we talked about, if like, oh, you can tell it's a Spielberg movie, but at the same time, what a Spielberg movie has been has kind of evolved over time to where even, like, with the blockbusters he's done in recent years, which some of them have been lesser than others, but like a Tintin, there are elements of, like, Indiana Jones, but it's, like, clearly just, like, no, we're going to take advantage of, like, the animation in this, and we're going to do just, like, as much stuff that breaks traditional cameras as we could possibly do with it. And, I mean, I would say my favorite of his, this is an unpopular opinion necessarily, but it is Jaws. Jaws is obviously like such a perfectly constructed movie that like revolutionized like so much about blockbuster culture and horror and so many other things. But when you watch that movie, I just always get swept in about like, oh wait, no, this is a very wonderful, like sort of character focused, like action or genre movie that still at the same time, like it develops its characters so beautifully and through a lot of like visual stuff that is still just like so engrossing at the same time that it's righteous and fun and so awesome to watch. And then my underrated is a movie we talked about on the show. We kind of did it as a bad pick for Stanley Kubrick, which was a weird sort of like facsimile thing, but I'm so glad we got to discuss it because I think this movie has aged like a fine wine, and I think is still one that like deserves a lot more attention, of AI, artificial intelligence, which is like such a fascinating, real fulcrum point for his career. Just like it still has like a lot of the big spectacle that he would be known for in like from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but it's him really embracing like the sadness element of his career, the true sadness that would like really progress forward all the way up until recently, The Fabelmans, which is what I, by the way, was referencing earlier with David Lynch. He has a cameo in that movie as John Ford at the very end of the movie, and it's tremendous, and it's such a great use of Lynch, and it's such a great thing with Spielberg. But even that movie, or I think if Spielberg had made that movie about like his childhood, like in the 90s, it would be a lot more like sweeping movies about movies, kind of like, oh, the magic of cinema movie. But it's an incredibly depressing movie about the fact that like, yeah, you can love movies, but also movies reveal so much about like your relationships with people and how it can really like tear you and your family apart at the same time you love this thing that you're embracing as like a career and a passion. But to get back to AI, I think that movie is a great example of just like him taking a lot of the elements he learned from his blockbuster culture and transitioning over into being an incredibly upsetting movie about like a child who cannot be with its mother and realizes that, oh no, my mommy will leave me, and I'm stuck in this cruel world that has no sympathy for me, but I still at the same time want to go back to mommy at this whole time. And I think that that element is like so like fascinating and tragic at the same time that all this big massive sci-fi stuff is going on with it. It just shows that guy contains multitudes. He's not just the Jurassic Park guy. He is also a man who is able to really take that kind of sweeping element that like you grew up on and you were nostalgic about in like the 80s and 90s, and then kind of turn it on its head once he does like very serious dramatic movies that are like still like engrossing, entertaining, but also very like sad and upsetting and fill you with a different sense of emotion beyond like, oh wow, wonder and like amazing. This is like, oh no, I'm also very sad. I'm so sad about this. He's a dude that contains a lot more multitudes than I think people give credit for, especially as so many people have tried to rip him off. You know, like I know, I'm sorry if J.J. Abrams is on your list, Adam, but he would not be because of how close an imitator he is.
No. I mean, you know, he's Spielberg, dude. I mean, what? You know, the thing is, even if he was only the Jurassic Park guy, that's enough. Like,
or just the Jaws guy, or just the Raiders guy, or just
right, exactly. That's the beautiful thing about Spielberg. He could be just he did Schindler's List. Holy shit, he did Schindler's List. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this guy, Steven Spielberg is, you know, Christ, I can't say anything bad about the fucking guy. He's done some of the greatest movies that have ever been made, and continues to pump out quality work. I hate musicals. I was like, West Side Story was dope.
Yep. I saw it with him, folks. I saw it. He liked it.
I liked it. The guy knows how to make a fucking like a picture. He's fucking great. He's one of the old school modern masters still working today. He 1,000,000% would have been on my list uh, until A, you said, I think I want to put him on mine. And B, like I said, I tried to steer away as much as I could from the big names. Because there's definitely one that is in my honorable mentions who probably would have been my number two if we were even ranking that. But no, he's fucking great, dude. He's Steven Spielberg. You know, Jaws is a fucking masterpiece. And AI, the only reason it was the bad pick for the Kubrick because I didn't know what the fuck else to pick. I love AI. AI is a masterpiece. It's just, yeah, no, Steven Spielberg he's one of those guys where, oh, favorite directors. Well, Steven Spielberg. He's one of the first names mentioned to anyone you talk to. He has universally just united the fucking world in movies. Like he's the greatest spectacle blockbuster director that's ever lived, and that might be giving him a little bit of discredit because all of his movies are spectacle blockbusters. But even if that's all he did, he's one of the greatest that ever lived. My favorite Spielberg bit is a stupid Saturday Night Live thing where they're making Laser Cats 5. And they're
Oh,
trying,
yeah, that's right.
trying to
They're
get
pitching it to
Vince
Spielberg.
Lord. What if we got Steven Spielberg? Yeah, good luck with that. Yeah, all right, come on in. Laser Cats! And he walks in pushing the TV on the fucking rack. Like, it's just Spielberg. That's the other thing about him. Like, a lot of guys talk about, he's not afraid to, like, make a joke on himself, too. Like, I fucking love Steven Spielberg.
And even like he was so instrumental in getting like an Animaniacs done, and they parodied the fuck out of him like all the time. Where
Nonstop.
the Wacko Yakko and Doc would just show up in his fucking office, just like, we want to pitch a movie to you, Stephen. And stuff like that. He really embraced that. I think he's also another one of those great examples of like director who has like a persona that like people like really love. Just like, oh, it's Uncle Steven.
I've seen so many movies that are like, where there's actors in the movie and it shows the director, and it's clearly supposed to be Steven Spielberg. Like where he's got the glasses, he's got the ball cap on, the hair coming out from underneath, the vest. Like Steven Spielberg is one of those guys. Like, oh, just do that. Like make someone look like that, and everybody will believe it's a director.
Right, where everyone knows who Steven Spielberg. Even like your aunt who doesn't watch that many movies, just like, oh, you're gonna be the next Spielberg, little boy, or whatever. Like he's so culturally ubiquitous, and he's definitely one of those ones where he's my list. I try to like vary up with like a bunch of different like weird choices, but there are two who are very typical of sort of like, oh, like the obvious names that I had to pick. He's one of them, and I'll get to my other one in a bit. But Adam, your next choice.
Yeah. All right, my next choice. I know this sounds crazy, and I didn't mean to do this, but my top three are actually my top three because when I was writing the list, the first three that popped to mind are the three I wrote down. 2 and 3 could be interchangeable, but number 3, I have I think this guy is just a master director, especially genre films. But when he's sort of ventured outside of genre films, he's also made masterpieces. We've talked about him on the show. He's still going strong. He's still fucking cranking them out. I have Canada's own David Cronenberg. To me, Cronenberg has just done, for the most part, I would say 90% of his career of the things he's put out have been great. Not necessarily all masterpieces, but at least great. Uh, there's a couple here and there that I'm not a huge fan of. Like I'm not crazy about Existence. I'm not crazy about Rabid. There's some that are like okay, but for the most part, I mean Cronenberg. Jesus Christ, man! Talk about having a sort of identity as a filmmaker to where you watch a Cronenberg movie. Oh, this is David fucking Cronenberg, especially when it's genre. The body horror and stuff. I'd say he's sort of the master of that. There's so much shit he's done that has just fucked me up in the head and stayed with me in a good way. I mean, The Fly, Jesus Christ. Honestly, one of the top two greatest sci fi horror remakes of all time if I mean interchangeable maybe with number one, the David Cronenberg's The Fly. It's amazing. And then sort of his resurgence with Viggo Mortensen and the movies they did together, and which were all pretty good. I'd say probably the weakest was the Sigmund Freud one, uh, but still not a terrible film. It's just he's fucking great, and the guy is like, whatever, I'll just do weird shit. We're gonna make this super sexual and super gory, and that's what I want to do. And now, like, his kid's into it, and his kid like is making great movies, like Possessor. What the fuck? But if I got to talk about my favorite Cronenbergs, I mean, like I said, The Fly would probably be my favorite genre, but I really, really love Eastern Promises. I think that is just a phenomenal sort of crime gangster cop movie coming from David Cronenberg, and it's fucking just maybe Viggo Mortensen's best, maybe Naomi Watts' best, maybe Vincent Cassel's best, like kind of everybody in it. Like, is this their best work? And then when you really get the tinge of the Cronenberg, where you get that uncomfortable, horrifying shower fight, you're like, oh, this is Cronenberg. You're okay. And it's just, but it's so fucking good, and it's just layers upon layers of just deceit and crime, and the way it's shot and the way it's acted. It's just, it's so fucking good. And then for my underrated, just because didn't make a lot of money, people in our circle might talk about it, but a lot of people don't know about it. The weird ass bizarre Crimes of the Future. I know it's a new one, but it's really fucking good. It's so bizarre and so weird, but again, the cast, like, what is Kristen Stewart doing in this movie? But I fucking love it. Like, whatever her choices are, they're great. And Cronenberg's just like, yeah, let's go for it, do it. I mean, that's just you could tell he really indulges his actors and lets them do what they want to do, but he also has a distinct vision. So he sort of guides them into his vision at the same time, and it's just he's a master.
Another one that's like on my honorable mentions only because I knew you would put him on your list. But yeah, love Cronenberg. Completely agree. I think what's so interesting too is that he's somebody who are like, I've talked to so many like people on my list, or just like people who like the sort of intimacy and like the character interactions. Cronenberg feels kind of like the opposite, where there are like The Fly, I would argue, is like the closest one where there is like kind of like that intimate tragedy to the relationship going on there. But some of these movies are like so cold about the character interactions, but at the same time they're so fascinating that still doesn't make me less engaged with like most of his movies. Some of them, like A Dangerous Method, is the one you were talking about, the Sigmund Freud one that I wasn't as huge on. But at the same time, like at his best, he's still able to like capture like these characters who don't really have like a huge intimacy to them, despite the fact that they can often be having very intimate situations, very sexual situations. Like there's still this like weird kind of cold sleekness to the degree that even when he stopped making genre films, he was still making weird movies about that kind of thing. Like I just watched Crash earlier this year. That movie is bizarre and is like so focused on such a fascinating sort of like sexual intimacy that at the same time is still very detached and weird, and feels like almost these characters are like weird alien people that aren't quite human, but at the same time there is a weird human fascination to them. There's like so many weird layers to that. But yeah, I think he's been a very consistent, very engrossing filmmaker, and I'm glad, he came back with Crimes of the Future. Keep on pumping them out, crony.
Yeah, man, give me more weird shit like that. Let's
Yeah.
go. Fuck.
Yeah. Let's fucking go. But yeah, so for my penultimate choice on my list, I really wanted to have an animator director on my list. There's always a trouble with animation directors where sometimes they can be very anonymous and they're like multiple directors, so it's kind of hard to pinpoint a specific one. But I kind of just came to the conclusion, especially as like this is somebody who I watched like a couple of his movies when they were like originally coming out, like in the 2000s. At least when they came out in the 2000s, he made movies before that. But this guy and his like craft, especially for sort of style of animation that I'm not as hugely familiar with as we talked about on the show previously. But despite my lack of knowledge about overall anime, I love the films of Hayao Miyazaki. All the Studio Ghibli movies, I think, are to some degree fascinating that he did, and I think he has like so much like there's that wonder and joy that's going on there that like what any child could embrace about these movies, but at the same time there's a lot more like adult themes that are going on under the surface of things, and I think he does such an incredible job with mixing so many of those tones and doing it with, despite whatever kind of barrier I could have culturally or with the language. If I'm watching the non-dubbed, actual subbed versions of these movies, there's still like a real human experience that's going on with any of these like weird, fantastical movies he makes. There still is like a real human kind of like either curiosity or fascination. Like My Neighbor Totoro is a movie a young kid could enjoy, but even me on like the level of like, oh, this is a movie about these kids kind of like trying to find their own like imagination way in the world as sort of a tragedy is going on in the background, and there's so much beauty and heartwarming like elements that at the same time there's a hint of that tragedy there. And I love that, and especially like, as these movies kind of like deal with even more mature things, like Kiki's Delivery Service is like a fun movie about a witch that a kid could enjoy, but it's also about trying to like get into the workforce and trying to make a living and work, like live on your own, and having a lot of those trepidations about it, and like the exhaustion that comes with like trying to provide for yourself and take care of yourself at the same time. There's like so many layers even to that. But my favorite of his is Spirited Away, which was the movie that won him his Oscar for Best Animated Feature, and is still a tremendous movie that has like sort of an Alice in Wonderland kind of vignette style to it in terms of like the story, but there still is another one of those movies that has like a lot more thematic depth to it about like somebody, who has lost contact with their parents and is trying to make their way in terms of like getting this job at like the bathhouse and stuff like that. This young girl trying to like kind of make her way in a world that feels like cruel and harsh, but at the same time finding beauty in the middle of that with like all the different like the dragon guy and the big weird ghost dude who's like one of my favorite sort of like designs in any animated movie. Is so tremendous. And then in terms of the underrated, I feel like most of his movies are like very celebrated, especially by those who like love anime in general. But the one that was like a rip roaring adventure that I just loved so much is Porco Rosso, which is another one that's dealing with adult themes about like fascism and being kind of like dejected and tossed aside by society, but kind of learning to embrace who you actually are as a person and figure a lot of that out, while at the same time being a movie about like a Red Baron dude who fucking flies around and like beats the shit out of fascists. Like, fuck yeah, Pigman. Fight the shit out of those fascists. It's so fun, so enthralling, and at the same time it's like very beautiful and engrossing. All of his movies do that. There's such a tremendous like beauty and warmth and heart to them that at the same time they're like really, like you feel on like such an emotional level about like kind of like growing up and coming of age and that ennui, but also you're just transported to a completely different fucking world, and it shows just like the power of what animation can do, no matter like where it's from or anything like that. They can really engross anybody who watches it.
Yeah, this dude was definitely on my honorable mentions. I think I've said it before on the show. If I haven't, I've told you. Spirited Away is my all-time favorite animated film. I absolutely love it. It makes me cry. It creeps me out. It's just, it's wonderful. I can't wait till my daughter is not a scaredy cat anymore, so she can watch it with me. I think it's genuinely a masterpiece of filmmaking, be it animated or not. Everything I've seen out of him, I haven't seen all of his stuff, but everything I have seen has just been wonderful. There's not one that'd be like, it was okay. They've all been great. I have not seen Pocoroso. Sounds fucking great. Like, I want to see some Red Baron beat the shit out of fascists.
With a pig face. I didn't really mention that specifically. He has a pig face. He's cursed
Yeah,
with a pig face.
I'm cool with that. But yeah, I mean Miyazaki. I struggled with that too. Like, do I put an animated director? But I ran into the problem you were talking about. Like, they're all. It's like several directors, several directors. It's hard to find a run, at least in mainstream American film animation, where it's been the same guy for some. Unless it's like a Brad Bird. I'm like, I'm good. But it's just, yeah, Miyazaki. If you're gonna pick one, that's the one.
Well, what's the next one you're picking as your penultimate choice on your list, Adam? We're getting down to the wire.
My number two, probably the greatest sort of, not necessarily modern, but 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s horror director, at least in my opinion. I think he's given us some of the greatest shit ever. I think there's a certain genre that wouldn't exist without him. I have John Carpenter. A lot of his shit near the end sort of fell off, wasn't of great quality. Ghosts of Mars, I'm looking at you, The Ward, even vampires, even though I like parts of vampires except for James Woods. But Carpenter's always just done cool movies. Whether or not they're great, they're cool. Like there's something about them, like, oh, all right, yeah, I can get with this. Like it's just John Carpenter, the old curmudgeon, smoking his cigarettes. Sometimes gives a shit, sometimes doesn't give a shit. Likes to play a guitar, make horrible music videos. Uh, he's such an icon for me. He's not necessarily responsible for the first horror movie I've ever seen, but he's responsible for some of the greatest I've ever seen. He's sort of responsible for me really getting into the genre and appreciating it as an art form other than it's just a scary film. I mean, that could be Halloween, it could be, Prince of Darkness, it could be They Live. I mean, there's so many that are just masterpieces. But of course, I'm going to go with probably the easiest one to go to, but it's for a reason why everybody references it. I mean, The Thing. The Thing is a fucking masterpiece, whether it's the claustrophobic setting, the actors, the obviously the practical effects, the story alone. I mean, everything about The Thing really works, and it's terrifying. It is absolutely, to this day, still terrifying. The paranoia and the claustrophobic aspect of it are fucking scary, and it's that's why the 2011 one tried to duplicate it, didn't work. Because if you're not John Carpenter, if you're not that cast, if you're not Rob Bottin on practical effects, it's not going to work. John Carpenter is a absolute master, and for the underrated one, it's one that I love. I think you really like it. I know a lot of other people really like it, but when I mention it to other people, maybe who aren't really into genre films or maybe novices or whatever you want to call it, they don't know what it is In the Mouth of Madness. I think In the Mouth of Madness is one of the greatest Lovecraftian movies that is not directly based on a Lovecraftian thing. And if you've listened to the show before or know me personally, you know I'm really into Lovecraftian type horror. And In the Mouth of Madness is fucking right up there as one of the best, one of Sam Neill's best performances. Actually, he's been in two of the greatest Lovecraftian type films of all time, Possession and In the Mouth of Madness, and Event Horizon. He's just, it's a great movie, and it just, John Carpenter being John Carpenter, putting out great shit.
Yeah, the Carpenter run from, like, I would say Assault on Precinct 13 all the way through, I would argue, like, In the Mouth of Madness, even with, A Memoirs of an Invisible Man kind of being in there at a certain point. But, like, most of, like, that run from, like, the mid-70s through, like, the mid-90s is, like, full of mostly just massive fucking great genre bangers. Like, so many of them. Like, and it's so astounding that, like, he's another one of those guys where he could just be the Halloween guy. A lot of people know him as the Halloween guy who aren't, like, big genre fans necessarily. It's just like, oh yeah, John Carpenter's Halloween, right? I've seen Halloween. But there's, like, so many other, like, great ones that are in there. Like, as much as I agree The Thing is amazing, my favorite is still Escape from New York. I love how, like, that one,
So good.
it's so fucking good, and it takes, like, such a varying, like, a weird take on, like, a weird kind of, like, dystopian future movie that's, like, so wonderful. And even when he would occasionally step out of just, like, the genre, the horror genre itself with, like, that, or Starman is, I think, a great underrated movie. That's, like, a tremendous little, like, sci-fi. Yeah, he directed Starman.
No, I know he did. I didn't even think of that. Put it as the underrated. That's an actually great choice. So like Big Trouble in Little China.
Right. Yeah, another, like, a very weird movie. Like, Starman is, like, the much more, like, a mainstream audience could, like, watch and feel, like, very embracing of Starman, as opposed to Big Trouble in Little China is, like, so weird. That's, like, a couple years later.
It's great.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great movie. But yeah, even with, like, some of the lesser movies he would do later, there's still at least, like, in some of them, I would say there's, like, some interesting, bizarre elements. Like, I would say Escape from LA or Vampires are very weird, bad movies. That I'm just like, okay, these are, like, very bizarre choices I wouldn't make necessarily, but, like, you go with that. Even Ghost of Mars, I think, has a bit of that. The Ward, not necessarily, unfortunately, very anonymous. But yeah, and he's another one of those guys with a great sort of, like, off-camera personality that you see in interviews that's great, which is, like, gets kind of craggy, and he's just like, I don't know. Fuck this bullshit. I don't care. I'm gonna smoke weed and play video games. Which I love that too. Like, he loves video games, which is, like, the most mainstream shit. Like Sonic. He loves Sonic so much.
I know, that's awesome.
John Carpenter for Sonic 3, the movie. Direct John.
God.
Do it.
Good Lord.
Do John Carpenter's Sonic 3. Oh, all right. Adam, we gotta get to our number ones here.
Yep.
It's time. We're gonna do our numero uno number one picks, and I'll start here with mine. I mentioned earlier Spielberg was one of the guys, which is like a bit more kind of like obvious choice to some degree that like a lot of people would kind of point to as like great director. This guy also is that, but I think just for the fact that like the dude has been making movies since like the late '60s, and I would argue has made maybe one bad movie necessarily. He's made some movies I like more than others, but I don't think this dude has made like a genuinely like terrible film at all in his massive giant career. I am talking about Mr. Martin Scorsese, who I mean, it's like he's definitely one of those guys where like when people think about filmmakers, they think of Martin Scorsese, and like also like, oh, it's Scorsese, the Italian guy picks Scorsese, but at the same time he makes very like obviously a lot of like great sort of like Italian American pieces of cinema. He also just manages to like make these movies that aren't even as specifically identifiable on that cultural level and just do weird twists and turns. Like Taxi Driver isn't specifically like Italian American story, but it has like such a great sort of immersive, vile look at like the seedy underground of like New York City at that particular time, and really captures like moments. I love like you can see the history of like the late 20th century through the 21st century through Scorsese's movies, and there's such like a tremendous like whether he captures a particular moment in time, whether he's recreating it like with Gangs of New York, or he's like really immersing you in it at that specific time that's happening, like with Taxi Driver, or even something as left turn as like Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. He's another guy that like really immerses you in an environment. At the same time, he immerses you in like the characters and what's going on there. And there's like obviously like the great soundtrack choices, the amazing like elaborate shots, and so many like other elements there. But at the same time, like Scorsese is so phenomenal at really getting you immersed in the idea of like, oh, like I'm so swept up in say like the crime world, and like my favorite movie of his, Shocker, another like great, well celebrated movie, Goodfellas. You're so immersed in the crime and the familial elements of that crime family that are going on. You're like really like in it, and you're like, oh my god, I want to like live in this world, and you like really feel it. And then he just completely tosses the fact that it's like, no, this world will completely chew you up and spit you out if you were to try and be in it. He does such a great job of like thinking like, oh, I want this kind of life, and then realizing like, nope, you don't want that at all. It's really fucked up and really upsetting. And even in like the other movies where he kind of has those temptation elements, there's still always that like tug and pull of just like, oh, the rug's pulled out under you. Or even when he's not trying to do that with like, Taxi Driver, I mentioned, you're like Bringing Out the Dead, other things like that, where you're just like in the middle of this disturbed character's like reality that you would never want to be a part of. You're still just like engrossed in like, I gotta see what this fucker does next. I can't believe what's going on here. This is such a weird, bizarre left right turn that like is going on with this character. I gotta follow what's happening. And I think a great example of that for my underrated, I think just one of the great underrated pieces of like especially dark comedy that's ever been made. It's a movie I've talked about on a friend of the show, Ray Telsh's show. I have not seen this. The King of Comedy is just one of my favorite fucking movies. I think that's such a tremendous example of how to do a comedy that is still at the same time not like haha funny. It is like so deeply awkward and upsetting, and you're just like, oh my god, I don't want to be anywhere near Rupert Pupkin, but at the same time, I'm fascinated to see him go on this journey to like try and become this talk show host, even though he's doing it through horrible, upsetting means. You still got like follow it, and you can see like he's created so many like big stars, like De Niro obviously in his early career, and then Leonardo DiCaprio helping him get started. But like the way he just uses like random people is so like wonderful that like the people that he will cast in this movie, they just pop up being even like a scene that makes such a massive impression, like Don Rickles in Casino, or the Action Bronson in The Irishman, shit like that. We're just like, what the fuck are you doing here? But like he just likes these distinctive faces. That's the thing, is like Scorsese knows how to make really distinctive, either like really immersive character pieces that you're just like, I'm following this guy through this whole movie, or when just a random person shows up, they're really just like iconic in their own weird way, for like you popped up for a scene and immediately I just know who you are, and I love whatever your weird idiosyncratic like personality is. Like even he did that with his mom, like in Goodfellas. One of the best scenes in Goodfellas is just all like Joe Pesci, Ray Liotta, and Robert De Niro hanging out at Scorsese's mom's place. And it's like such a fun, immediately immersive, like, oh my god, I feel like I'm living in this scene with these people. I think it's that long rambling diatribe basically just to say Martin Scorsese's a great director. Hot take. Love him.
Mom, I gotta cut it off. It's a sin. No, I mean, yeah, dude. Yeah, I mean, if I like, I purposely didn't include Scorsese on my list. Like I said at the beginning, I was trying to go with the obvious. He would have definitely been on mine. I mean, he's Martin fucking Scorsese, man. He's done some of the greatest films of all time. I mean, yeah, Goodfellas, absolutely agree. Probably my favorite of his. But and just to go back to your like, oh, of course the Italian guy picks, Scorsese. Yeah, he did do a lot of mafioso movies, but hey, he won the Oscar for an Irish crime movie. He also did Silence.
Last Temptation of Christ.
Yeah, he could do anything. And the thing is about him too, like, yeah, he's gotten a lot of shit lately about what he said about the MCU movies or whatever. Fuck off. Fuck off. Martin Scorsese has always been open to making a joke about himself. He played a goddamn blowfish. You know what I mean? Like,
Shark Tale, yes.
yeah. He's Martin Scorsese, man. The guy's a fucking master. He's a master. There's nobody who does a better mafia movie. There's a guy who comes close because, look at the fucking Godfather. But Martin Scorsese is Martin Scorsese. I mean, he's as synonymous with film as a Spielberg or some of these other guys. It's just he's Martin Scorsese, man. I
Yep.
cannot fault you in any way for your number one. And if anybody does,
Yeah.
they can go fuck themselves.
Well, I mean, on the other hand, you were right, Adam. He did say that he didn't consider the MCU movies cinema, so he should have just raked over the coals. And he only makes one type of
Right.
movie, and that's a good point.
Yeah,
he's
right, exactly.
such a
No,
hack fraud.
100%.
With
Yeah,
his,
what a fucking piece of
go
shit.
get your shine box and get off your fucking eyebrows, your bushy ass eyebrows. Oh, you want to preserve classic film? Go fuck yourself, like Captain America. Get
Right,
the fuck
you
out of here.
idiot. You idiot.
Oh, well, Adam, you're the last one with a pick. Who's your number one? Who is your top favorite director of all time?
Gee, I wonder. Because I haven't proclaimed this on the show several times, or to you. My number one filmmaker of all time is Michael Mann. I think Michael Mann is in a league of his own. The way he shoots action, the way he shoots dialogue, the way he can like sort of center a frame, the way he got into digital way before a lot of other mainstream guys and really ran with it. I mean, it was like him, Soderbergh, this other class, but Michael Mann just fuck, man. Everything I've seen him do, even his weakest ones, Public Enemy and The Keep, there's still something in there in both of them to where you're like, oh, that was a cool shot. Like, I got to give it that. Oh, that's a good song choice. Okay. Oh, that's a good fucking character actor to pop up to play this role. I would have never thought of that, but that works. Michael Mann, to me, just anything he's put out has just been electric and exciting. He's just my guy as far as a filmmaker. He's my guy. I put him in first coach. There's such a level of kinetic, like I said, kinetic energy to his films that I don't think anybody else has. The sort of POV behind the barrel shots in Public Enemies or Miami Vice or some like it almost makes you jump and startle you. Like, you holy fuck, you almost feel like you're there at the moment, and it's just great. I mean, he's gotten the best out of almost anybody he's worked with. I'd argue, well, I'll just say it. My favorite film of all time was also my pick for my favorite film is Heat. I'd say Al Pacino in Heat is the best usage of like late 80s, early 90s Pacino that existed until he started doing the HBO movies and stuff, which are really good.
And the masterpiece Jack and Jill, of course.
Oh, of course, yes, of course. But until the best sort of the hoo-ah Al Pacino, he worked so well in that movie. Obviously, they cut out the shit where he was a cokehead, which yeah, but he worked.
Couldn't have
so
ever
well.
tell by anything he does in that movie.
No, nothing. You get shot walking your doggy. She's got a great ass. But so you get that moment, but then you get the moment, Pacino and De Niro in the diner, which is still, I know it's been quoted so many times, and of course it has, because it's fucking great. These are two titans of acting just working off each other. You get probably the only time I ever liked John Voight is in this movie. But then you get De Niro with his love interest sitting on the hill late at night, and with just the beautiful sort of duskscape in front of them, and it works so well. Everything about that movie is perfect. I can't. It's Michael Mann. I love Michael Mann. And then for not necessarily underrated, because people who have seen it love it, but underseen, fucking Thief. Thief is great. Easily the best James Caan. I mean, of course, James Caan is Sonny Corleone, great, but James Caan and Thief, amazing. Thief is such a cool, slick movie. Great soundtrack, synth score and parts. It just Thief is fucking great, and again, criminally underseen.
Yep, this was the one where you told me specifically, like, don't steal Michael Mann, and I wouldn't steal him from you necessarily, even though he definitely would have been potentially on my list. I agree that I think whether it's in the sort of like film age that he started in or the digital age that he kind of helped revolutionize after a certain point, he has such a great, especially tactile sense of like whatever a character is doing. Like you see in Heat, there's all the stuff with like Val Kilmer trying to like, put the gun together basically, which is like apparently very praised as being very accurate, and it's like, yeah, I mean, I get it. I'm immediately just like immersed in like, oh my god, this guy's doing this, and so I immediately believe in like whatever action's about to take place. And he does that with like all of his movies pretty much. There's like such an interesting tactile nature to them. I mean, I would say in terms of like the underrated, I guess it's not in as much as like when it came out at the time, it was nominated for a bunch of Oscars, but it kind of disappeared, and it's a bummer because I think this movie's so great and feels a bit different from like his other movies, but still has like a lot of his great sort of like tactile elements, even though it's about journalism. The Insider fucking rules. I fucking love The Insider. That movie is so fucking awesome.
So
Probably my
fucking
favorite
good.
Crow.
It's so fucking good.
And like another great example, like Al Pacino during that era that you're talking about, where he's like very over the top, but he's a lot more tempered in that movie. And it's such like it's a very nuanced performance from him. But like Christopher Plummer and Bruce McGill, such a great fucking movie as well. But yeah, I would say the only ones I'm not extremely huge on, I would say, are like mainly The Keep, and Public Enemies. Like even we had our tit for tat about Last of the Mohicans, which I know you love so much, but there still is like a lot I can respect about that movie, even if I don't love it necessarily.
Shut your goddamn mouth.
But still, yeah, Mann is tremendous. He is the man, and I can't wait for that fucking his Ferrari movie to finally get made. I'm very curious what he's gonna do then. That James Mangold movie kind of did and was like, oh, that was fine.
Yeah, we'll see.
It's fucking Adam Driver, Adam. He's driving around his Ferrari.
I like Adam Driver.
Yeah, for sure. But, Adam, we've been talking for a while, so I know we have honorable mentions, but let's go through them quick. Because we've been here for a very long time. I think this might be the longest we've ever done, just the two of us on a podcast. And, I mean, there was a lot to talk about.
It definitely is. Oh, no, it definitely is.
For sure.
Yeah, I agree. Just rattle them off.
Oh, you want me to rattle off first? I was kind of giving you the intonation to
okay, yeah,
rattle
let's
off
go.
first.
I'll rattle them off. You ready? I'm going to go fast.
Yes.
Pedro Moldovar, Cameron Crowe, Inarritu, Guillermo del Toro, Darren Aronofsky, George Romero, Wes Craven, Sergio Leone, Robert Eggers, Richard Donner, Joel Schumacher, Frank Darabont, Clint Eastwood, Dario Argento, James Cameron, Jim Jarmusch, Peter Jackson, Quentin Tarantino, Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah, a lot of really good directors in there for sure.
Tried to go as fast as I could.
Yes. And I'll go ahead and just rattle off my honorable mentions, well, some of which were either on your honorable mentions or on your list in general. Steven Soderbergh, Guillermo del Toro, Catherine Bigelow, Ryan Johnson, Spike Jonze, David Cronenberg, Spike Lee, John Carpenter, the Coens, and somebody who, if I think he did more movies, I want to see him continue to do movies, even though he's done only 3 at this point, but Jordan Peele feels like he's prime to take that spot in the near future.
Yeah, that's where I sit with like a Robert Eggers. Same way. Like he's on my honorable mention, but I mean I loved everything that guy's done. So
yes, for sure. Well, everybody, thank you, patrons, for listening to this supersized bonus podcast. We're ending the year on a big banger. This is probably going to be, we knew going into this was going to be a very long discussion, but we thank all of you for being patrons and paying your $1 a month. It really helps keep the lights on. You guys are great. We appreciate all your time, your money, and just you being you.
Yeah, I appreciate most of your guys' time and most of your guys' money and most of you being you.
And
there's at least one or two of you that I don't fucking like.
And we also want to say, given this is coming out in December, just a general happy holidays out there to everybody.
Yeah, everybody. Happy holidays. Whatever you might celebrate. I hope you're with loved ones, and I hope that everything goes well for you the following year.
Yes, which we should mention, Adam. In 2023, we're going to be starting off in January with an audio commentary, and we kind of racked our brains about what are we going to do for an audio commentary for January. There's so much we could potentially do, and we decided on something interesting because there's a Friday the 13th in January. So we're going back all the way, like, since episode 10 of the main feed show, where we talked about the Friday the 13th franchise. We're going to be doing a commentary specifically on the 2009 Friday the 13th remake, which, despite the reputation in general of horror remakes, the both of us are pretty big defenders of that one.
I fucking love it to the point to where I would put it above pretty much any of the slasher remakes that have come out, if not above all. I think it's pretty fucking great.
And I would say it's like upper echelon of even just Friday the 13th movies in general. There's
Yeah,
only like a
I agree.
couple I would say I prefer.
Yeah,
honestly.
I agree.
For sure. But we will be talking along with watching that movie, and we'll try and put that out around the Friday the 13th, obviously, just to a bit of synergy, as it were, on that. But until then, we're very tired. We gotta say cut. Cut, everybody. That's a wrap. We gotta end this.
Yeah, get the fuck out, dude. Go get your breakfast burrito from fucking the food truck. We're done.